So I was told that as soon as I passed the speaker, the microphone would be on. Apparently it's true. Apparently it's true. So it's 2 o'clock, right? 1400. And I don't know of any kind of formal introduction process or anything like that, so I figured if it's 2 o'clock, I should start talking. I am Steve Fazzari, and I am doing the first 3 hours of the Instability mini course. Thank you for coming. I hope you find it interesting. It's a bit of a challenge, I have to say, to think about how you take a set of ideas and present them to a pretty diverse audience. I was speaking with Peter Scott, who's doing the corresponding thing in inequality, and he said, well, what should we assume? Should we assume people did the reading? I said, I wouldn't. And if you did, at least in my case, I view the reading as complement, not substitute. So I'll be talking about those 2 papers that I distributed in a broad sense. Probably the second part a little bit more specifically. The first part is kind of a broader, more overview of things along those lines. I don't know exactly what people's background are in terms of how much economics you've had and things along those lines. My own view is that this is going to be a session, especially the first half of it, more about ideas than technicalities. So in some respects, the kind of approach might not be the type of thing you'd think you'd find in a typical advanced doctoral seminar, but I'm hoping there's still new insights that I can be sharing with you, at least about the way I think about macroeconomics, ultimately instability. So I suppose in the broad sense I should say that, just to give you a rough sense of the plan, we have 3 hours scheduled total. Enno Schroeder made it very clear to me that I should take 2 breaks. I won't do that, I'll take 1. So I'm not following directions already. There's just a really natural two parts to this, so I think we'll do the first part in roughly an hour, take 20 minutes or so, and then we'll do the second part. So the first part is just kind of a perspective on Keynesian macroeconomics. The second part is more like a research seminar. So the second part will really be based on this new paper that I have done on instability and growth. So you can just see a bit of a dichotomy there. The other thing I want to suggest, and the technology people are good with this, is that we make this more like a classroom, which is a sense of, if you have a thought or a question, just bring it up at the time. There is this microphone in the middle, probably be better, all things considered, for future broadcast if people actually use the microphone, but we'll see how that works. You're saying you're going to keep the mic live, so questions from the floor will be broadly picked up from that. We'll just kind of see how that works as we go along. And if you folks back there have any issues, feel free to interrupt me and get me on track. So we'll kind of follow here along with the PowerPoint, but as you see, I'm quite willing to improvise as time goes along. So the first part of this kind of broad overview is based on, in some sense, on this paper I published with my co-authors, longtime co-authors, Greenberg and Faddy, which had some pretty specific objectives when we wrote the paper, but ended up being more than I expected at the time that we were putting the manuscript together, a bit of an overview of the way I think about Keynesian macroeconomics. And so I thought that might be an interesting place to start. And the title here, though, is a little different from the title of that paper. The title is Demand and Production. And the broad idea here is to motivate Keynesian macroeconomics. There are lots of different ways into this, but I want to do this specifically from the point of view of business firms, that firms produce what they can sell. So, people have different definitions of what means Keynesian macroeconomics. Some people will say, well, it's the macroeconomics when you have sticky wages and prices, a view which I actually disagree with rather strongly, and you'll hear more about that as we go through this. I think there's a more intrinsic definition of Keynesian macroeconomics that ultimately it's demand or sales, what firms can actually sell, that drives their production and their employment. So if production falls, if employment falls, this is because firms are selling less, because aggregate demand has gone down. And you notice on the slide I'm using the word micro foundations. The idea here is that this is, in a sense, the micro foundations. If I'm going to start from what I consider a more fundamentalist Keynesian perspective, the first micro foundation I'm going to work with is that the amount I produce, the number of workers I hire, is going to be related to what I'm actually able to sell. I guess I feel like I could take a little bit of a digression in the sense of going back to my own, when I was sitting where many of you are right now, just writing a doctoral dissertation or thinking about where I wanted to do my research, and my feeling was that that's where I should start. I was frustrated by the typical supply and demand or even profit maximization models of the theory of the firm, where this notion of how much you can sell or how much the firm could sell was somehow suppressed or left to the side. So actually, when writing the '98 paper that was distributed prior to this session, that was in a way the point, was to try to get that micro foundation into the into the way of thinking about the firm, and that's why the title of that paper has micro foundations in it. Now, I thought in this introductory context, though, I should also note that this whole mini course is supposed to be about instability in the broad sense. That's kind of trying to connect the different pieces. And this first part of the course, this next hour or so, I'll be talking about really very static models. So in one sense, instability doesn't come up here directly, but it's a foundation for instability in my view, that ultimately if you identify this basic behavioral assumption and understand it, that if we're kind of working our way back to the micro foundations, and sales or demand is the driving force of production and employment, then instability will arise from instability in demand, and that's something we'll talk about more in the second part of today's session, and you'll be talking about tomorrow. So that's the Lincoln of this first approach, and as the final point on the slide indicates, I consider this as kind of fundamental, or a word I've just newly adopted in this context, intrinsic Keynesian perspective. To think about demand as something that really is there in the first instance when you think about how modern economies operate, how production and employment gets determined. Okay, now let me just do a little positioning of these ideas in the context of a more mainstream interpretation of Keynes. So in the broad sense, the fundamental role of demand is lost. You can read, I mean, if you look at especially new Keynesian models right now, there's very little discussion of demand. The new Keynesian IS curve is kind of demand in the background there. It is there, but it's not emphasized as much. And again, there's this traditional mainstream definition, textbook definition of Keynesian macroeconomics as what happens if wages or prices are sticky, and that ultimately demand matters because of this nominal rigidity, and importantly, and this is where I really disagree, that the full adjustment of wages and prices would eventually imply convergence to full employment and potential output. So there's a kind of Keynesian short run where if you have a negative demand shock, if there's a reduction in expenditure in the economy, you can get unemployment. But as wages and prices adjust to the various disequilibria that exist after that negative demand shock, you kind of naturally and endogenously converge to potential output or full employment. And there can be a role for stabilization policy, and a lot of the new Keynesian, so-called new Keynesian macroeconomics emphasizes detailed discussions of monetary policy and how monetary policy could be structured to help economic performance. But the issue largely is about the speed of adjustment. How fast can you move from the short run to the long run? So I'm going to give you a different perspective of this, and I want to start by thinking, where we often do at the beginning of a production decision, which is with labor demand, and start with this simple theory of a perfectly competitive firm. The idea that we have, from a mainstream perspective, we have a firm that's taking prices given, and implicitly assuming that everything that's produced can be sold. So in a way, once you assert perfect competition as where you're going to begin your analysis, you've already suppressed the demand side, because the behavioral assumption is that the price is what the price, and whatever you choose to produce, you will be able to sell at that price. So, in the US or here in central Canada, you can say, think about wheat or corn or other things that are produced in this way, and there's probably some truth to that. But the vast majority of what we, what's produced in modern economies really is not produced in that kind of a market. The other thing that I think is interesting in this context and where demand, kind of moves away is I've got this typical, first order condition for profit maximization for a perfectly competitive firm. The real wage equals the marginal productivity of labor. So the price is given, the wage rate, the nominal wage rate is given by the market. So what's really happening is the firm is this repository of a production function. It's this technology. And once you know the marginal productivity of labor, you know labor demand. In a advanced undergraduate or maybe introductory graduate course, if I were teaching this and when I had more time, I'd be drawing pictures on the board with production functions and these kinds of things and saying, well, we solve a simple optimization problem. We say, real wage equals the marginal productivity of labor is the first order condition for profit maximization. And now let's draw a labor demand curve. And the labor demand curve would have the real wage on the vertical axis and employment on the horizontal axis. And the demand curve itself would be the marginal productivity of labor. It is entirely a function of well, not even a function of, it is entirely determined by the technology. It is a characteristic of the production function. Once you know the production function, you know the marginal productivity of labor. Once you know the marginal productivity of labor, you know labor demand. And if I'm looking at this from the motivation that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, this is odd, this is unusual, because where is the fact of whether I can sell the output or not? Well, it's effectively, I was going to say implicit, maybe you'd say it's explicit, but it's in the assumption of perfect competition, in the assumption that no matter what I produce, I will be able to sell it. And even the profit maximization problem, if I'd written it out formally, would make that clear, that you'd have revenue as being price times quantity, where quantity is whatever you choose to produce. And the assumption is, again, that you can sell it all. So demand, the ability of the firm to sell its output as a kind of separate and important behavioral foundation for making production and employment decisions has somehow disappeared. And in that respect, I consider perfect competition restrictive. Here I'm going to do another little digression on my own history. So I can actually maybe talk more about my PhD dissertation in the second part, but I wrote on, broadly speaking, demand and production. And one of the, but I started teaching and pulling these perspectives together actually fairly early in my career. And I thought, well, I should try to do something more along the lines of what that '98 paper became many years later by really putting fundamentally sales expectations into the firm's profit maximization problem with perfect competition. And I wrote this whole manuscript. I didn't have very many papers at that time, and I really kind of cared about this. And so, this whole paper, and I'd written it up, and I passed it around a little bit, and people gave me comments on it. And I was, pretty fired up about it. It had some very kind of cool little modeling conventions that I used. And I even submitted it to a journal. You've probably heard of it. It's called the American Economic Review. And I thought, well, this is kind of fundamental in what's going on. Sales expectations matter for output. This is really what I want. Employment and output. Sales expectations matter. Demand matters. And yeah, they rejected it. Nice letter got back from the editor saying, well, it's kind of creative, but does it really make sense to be talking about sales expectations with perfect competition? And I had to think about that and said, no, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, I kind of finessed that in some respects. I won't give you the detail, but the point is they just don't really go together in some respects. Once you take this notion that you can sell all you want at the prevailing price, then where's the room for sales expectations? The way I actually put it into the model, as I remember it, is I put some kind of uncertainty there, so I had some kind of probability of actually being able to sell the output ex post, which might have been kind of interesting in principle, but I'm happy to say that virtually everything I've written has gotten published. This one is, I don't know if it even exists anymore. It's before the hard disk days, so as far as I know, the manuscript is gone forever, and it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. It really wasn't what I was trying to get at. Perfect competition and this notion of demand mattering fundamentally at the microeconomic level turned out, I think, just not to fit very well together, and I think I kind of was off on the wrong track there. What makes this more manageable then is to introduce some kind of substantive micro-level demand constraint into the firm's production and employment decisions. And so this is where we adopted in the 98 paper this monopolistic competition. And you can see here on the slide I've given two conditions for production and employment in the context of monopolistic competition. One is that the real wage, the real wage equals the thing on the how can I do this? Here we go. The real wage equals the marginal productivity of labor times something. This something is, if you know this theory, is really pretty straightforward. This is our notation for it, but this is the, E there is the negative inverse elasticity of demand. It's kind of a techie term. What is it effectively? It's basically the slope of the demand curve facing the individual firms. And so what condition one really is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But marginal revenue now is a little more complicated than just price, because the firm, being an imperfectly competitive firm, recognizes it has to cut price if it wants to sell more. And E tells you how much you have to do that. If you have perfect competition, you can see that for the special case, E is going to be 0. So E goes between basically 0 and 1. 0 would be perfect competition, and as E rises above 0, you have really steeper and steeper demand curves facing the individual representative firms in the economy. So you have this generalization of the simple marginal cost equals marginal revenue condition from perfect competition. But in addition, you have this market clearing condition, which is now demand has to equal output. So F is the production function, and so at the optimal level of labor input and the capital input, which we assume is given in most of the simple applications of this, production, supply, output on the left-hand side equals demand. This condition one, which is the generalization of what we see from typical labor demand from perfect competition, is necessary but not sufficient. And what we do is interpret that condition one as basically a markup equation. So if you're familiar with basically markup models, I'm thinking of the Keynesian model in particular, which wouldn't come from these more neoclassical kinds of microfoundations, but eventually it comes to something which is pretty similar. That given the wage rate, you could solve this equation for price level, and it's going to be a straightforward markup equation where if you derive it from these monopolistically competitive microfoundations, the markup is a function of this elasticity of demand term, but it wouldn't have to come from that. You could have it come from other kinds of things. So the model really doesn't require this underlying more neoclassical foundation as long as you get to some kind of a markup relationship. Now, let me just stop here. Are there any questions about what I'm saying? I feel like I'm kind of being a little more technical than I expected, which is fine for this audience, but stop me if there's anything unclear. Okay, with me. Okay, so what this suggests is if we think about labor demand, it's really a point, not a whole schedule. That if you go back here and say, well, we have to. This could look like. I mean, suppose the marginal productivity of labor, if you do it this way, is a downward sloping function of employment, diminishing marginal productivity, and it's in a sense discounted by this elasticity of demand factor. So you could have a standard-looking curve that you're going to satisfy, but it's not like this curve is telling you, well, if I change the real wage, this will tell me how much employment changes. The real wage, in some sense, is endogenous. The firm is choosing, given the wage rate, the firm is choosing price. It's a monopolistically competitive firm. It's actually making a pricing decision and a quantity decision simultaneously. So this, being kind of on this curve is a necessary condition for profit maximization. But it doesn't tell you, it doesn't really say, I'll be someplace on it. Where am I going to be on it? It's going to depend on demand. It's going to depend on how much demand is out there, and that's condition two. So that when you interpret this profit maximization first order condition in this context, it becomes clear from my point of view that this is more about pricing in some respects, whereas the quantity comes from how much you can actually sell. So let me try to make that clear, because I think that's kind of central. I mean, if you start with perfect competition, it just seems like, well, I'll just produce whatever. I look at the prices. That's all there is to it, and I make a production decision. I assume I could sell as much as I want, and that's really where most textbook models and even most research models in new classical macroeconomics go, because they're almost all based on perfect competition. And so the demand is also has immediately dropped out of this kind of level of firm production decisions. But once you move to a monopolistically competitive environment, in a sense generalize this. That's why this equation 1 is helpful, where you see it's just a generalization of the simple idea. It nests perfect competition, but in general the E is going to be greater than 0. Once you go there, it becomes clear this is no longer sufficient, that there's two variables in one equation. There's employment, but there's also price. And so this is kind of an optimal markup condition where, what will pin this down, and ultimately what pins it down is the necessity of clearing the market. So again, in a little less formal environment where I was drawing with chalkboard behind me, I could think about an individual firm having a shift of its demand curve, and it will then re-optimize and set price appropriately, but respond to the kind of quantity signal it's getting by having a change in demand. So in a way here, I'm saying labor demand is a point on this kind of markup schedule, not the whole schedule itself. It's that point at which I am simultaneously optimizing profit by picking the markup appropriately, but also choosing a level of employment that will generate an output level that I can actually sell. So it becomes a much more substantial, in my view, way of thinking about production and demand, and a much more natural foundation, micro foundation, underlying behavioral foundation for a Keynesian macro model in that context. And in a way, now I'm kind of glad I brought up my little history of my disappointing paper, this is really what got back to it. I mean, I had this paper, I knew it was a good idea, or I thought it was a good idea. I knew it was a little too strong. I thought it was a good idea, but I could see the inconsistency with perfect competition, and came to the point where actually it turned out things were a little less complicated than I thought, that it was really very natural in an imperfectly competitive setting to think about shifts in demand as mattering for production. And then the question was, well, let's build a macroeconomic model on that point. So I'm going to go to the macro model in a second here, but let me talk a little bit about this, so remind myself where I am. So when I say restoring Keynesian behavior to micro foundations, I've just broadly made that point. So here's the set of what I'm going to consider general equilibrium conditions. So the idea is to embed this imperfectly competitive a micro foundation for firm production and employment decisions in a macroeconomic context. So here are the set of conditions and words that firms set the optimal markup. So the FM curve is that equation 1 from the previous slide. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost broadly. Production is going to be efficient. That's implicit in that thing, which is that you're going to basically be on the production function. So given the technology, given the capital stock, you'll produce what the labor you choose is capable of producing. That the market's effectively clearing, that demand in fact will be sufficient to purchase the efficient level of production, and we're going to consider this initially for a given nominal wage rate. So I'm leaving the nominal wage rate outside the model for the moment. And this leads to this picture right here. Let me just start off by saying, I have to look back and see what it looks like. I'm very, very proud of this picture, not so much because it's so intrinsically brilliant. I kind of like this back in the 90s when we put it together, but because I got it into PowerPoint. That was the real challenge I faced. I've been working this one way or another. I actually gave a version of this lecture a few weeks ago in Pisa invitation, and I was doing slides which I completely rewrote as it turned out for this purpose. But at this point, I said, well, I'm just going to draw this on on the board, and of course there was no board when I did it, so I kind of had this piece of paper, and I was having troubles with it. And I thought, well, probably in Waterloo at this fancy place they'll have a board, a whiteboard, blackboard, something like that, which obviously they don't. Although there's that stuff over there, I guess we could have wandered around to that purpose. But nonetheless, I said, it really would be kind of cool if I could do this. So, if you get nothing else out of this lecture, please admire my graphics. In fact, I'll tell you, if you ever try to do this, it's not perfect. You can see the little box doesn't quite match up in some respects. This was done with Microsoft drawing software. The trick to this is not to try to do it all in the software. That is to make the diagram itself, turn that into a PDF, turn it into a picture, paste it into your PowerPoint, and then put all the labels on with text boxes. Otherwise, at least with my level of technology expertise, all hell breaks loose. Anyway, I've now given you my ego has been sufficiently stoked by bragging about my picture. Let me go back to economics. So let's talk about this stuff, and I want to then exploit this diagram a little bit to talk about how this makes us think or helps us think about Keynesian macroeconomics. So here's the FM curve. So let's think about this as, basically it's this generalization of what's typically called labor demand. If we were in perfect competition, this would just be the marginal productivity curve. In a more general case, it's that 1 minus E times marginal productivity of labor. So this is what goes down here. Here's the, I should make this clear. So the way this diagram works, if you haven't read the paper, is that the origin is 0, and any movement away from the origin is a positive thing. So this is standard, right? Higher real wage over here, higher employment over here, but the production function is upside down because this is output on this axis, and so output's rising as you go down. So that's an upside down production function. The axis over here is the price level. And I have somewhat mixed feelings about this. I'll comment on this a little bit more, but let me get the basics out first. This is a more kind of traditional textbook aggregate demand curve. So what this is saying is as the price level falls, which means moving towards the origin, that demand rises, which means moving away from the origin. So the negative slope of the aggregate demand curve is reflected here. And so these are all economic relationships. I mean, this is technological more, but the kinds of things you'd see in the economy, you have these three diagrams. This one is a definition. So this last quadrant is just saying, well, this is the real wage on this axis, this is the price level on that axis. For a given nominal wage, which I'm calling W prime up there, you get a rectangular hyperbola. I mean, it just is what it is. This is for a given nominal wage, the relationship between W over P and P is going to look like this. And so that's just more or less for consistency, we have to have it there. Now, what is general equilibrium in this context? General equilibrium is a rectangle. It's a rectangle such that all the values are kind of internally consistent. So that in fact, given the nominal wage, firms are choosing the price level optimally. That means that they're on the FM curve. That'll generate a real wage. So that for a given nominal wage, that'll generate a price level. That price level will generate some level of demand, and that level of demand has to be consistent with what actually gets produced. So kind of broadly speaking, the right side of this diagram is the supply side. This is pretty much the demand side. This is, like I say, is just more a matter of a definition over here. And so this is consistency. I think one of my grad students a number of years ago went to finding, proving the conditions for kind of uniqueness and existence of this equilibrium. That was fine. I haven't paid a whole lot of attention. As I look at the diagram, I think it is unique, and if it exists at all, and existence just basically means that these curves kind of, when you find the box, the curve is actually there, as opposed to, say, demand never being high enough to get to an equilibrium over here. So, in a way, this is kind of a textbook aggregate supply and demand diagram, but interpreted in a little bit of a different way. I should say that there are a number of other Keynesian, post-Keynesian authors have gone this direction. Thomas Pally has a book from the 90s at some point where he has something similar. Just recently at a conference in Berlin, Mark Setterfield presented a paper which I believe is co-authored with Marc Lavoie, and is Giuseppe Fontana also involved, which is a kind of also similar thing. We're passing our papers around to each other and say we all had kind of, roughly speaking, similar ideas about the way to think about it. But this, in particular, I want to emphasize this labor demand as a point in this context, because you can really see it here, right? This point A, I've labeled all the equilibria in the various quadrants with these capital letters, A in this case, that this is the one point. I mean, this is labor demand in this context. It's the only point. It's not the whole schedule. It is only this one point. That is the one point where firms will simultaneously be satisfying their markup conditions, profit maximization if you take the neoclassical foundations, that is, they're on the FM curve and actually sell all the output that they can produce with that level of employment. There's, it's the only one. If you try to, come down here or something like that, you'll find that you end up being inconsistent. You'll work this way around, and the real wage that comes out this end will not be equal to the real wage the firm started out with. So there's only this one point. So it has that sense. Again, there's nothing aside from the monopolistic competition generalization, nothing too much different here from the typical textbook model, but it's a different way of looking at it that I think starts to illuminate some points. In particular, this notion that labor demand is a single point. Now, this might be a good point here. It's not in my slides specifically, but to comment on again, the perfect competition versus imperfect competition issue. Because in a way, when you get to this point, you could say, well, why does it really matter? So look, the FM curve is marginal productivity of labor times that elasticity term. If I set the elasticity equal to 0, the diagram's going to look the same. You could even do that. You could compare it. If elasticity, if this is a positive elasticity and you set it equal to 0, you shift this curve upward in a somewhat not exactly vertically. Its slope would change, but you ship it upward, and there would be a new general equilibrium. So you might say, well, why all this fuss about imperfect competition? And I should also here recognize another author, and this is actually cited in the '98 paper, that Paul Davidson, in an economic journal article, I can't remember the date, actually had done not this picture, but it made a similar argument about labor demand being a point. Davidson said in a Keynesian context, Keynes himself did assume perfect competition and assumed that businesses would produce along the marginal productivity of labor curve. It's one of his classical postulates from the early part of the general theory. But Davidson then points out, really labor demand is a point. And actually in this context, even under perfect competition, that would be true. So it's in a way, it suggests that the labor demand is a point going to result. It does not depend on imperfect competition, and I think that's correct. So you could say, well, why did I make this rather strong argument in favor of imperfect competition? And there are at least two reasons. One is realism, and just let's generalize the model. Let's think about this. There aren't too many, industries that look like corn farms in Iowa or Alberta or wherever. I mean, it's wheat farms in Alberta, I guess, that most industries are producing in a world where actually firms do in fact set prices, where they do have some elasticity of demand they pay attention to. So you can make the case for that, for realism, straight up. But in my mind, more importantly, is to support that intuition that I began with. The intuition that when businesses make production decisions, they are looking at demand. They are forecasting what they can sell. That this is fundamental to their basic production and employment decisions, which at some level is, I have become convinced in the context of putting this paper together that really kind of requires imperfect competition at the microeconomic level. If you are a farmer producing corn, taking the prices given, you're forecasting price, and that's pretty much it. Now you might say, well, I'm thinking about whether there's going to be crop failures and someplace else, and the price will be higher or lower, which in the broad sense is talking about market supply and demand. But at the level of the individual farmer, you're going to be able to sell all your corn. That's all there is to it. So kind of this notion that demand finds its way into production, which I personally take as a very strong intuition, is not maybe entirely general. That in the perfectly competitive world, that if that happens, it happens in some sense kind of indirectly. So I think we get a more substantive micro foundation for Keynesian macroeconomics when we have imperfect competition, even though I will agree that it is not strictly speaking necessary. But I think it's helpful to support this intuition about what drives production. Any questions, comments, thoughts? I'm going to kind of move away from micro foundation now and talk a little more macro. So that's a good point to pause. Yeah?
I don't quite understand your argument that when you have perfect competition, you are able to sell whatever you produce given the price. I mean, that's only true if you have the equilibrium price, but the farmer and the world market price of corn is lower
certainly you could be disappointed, right? You might have thought the price would be high and you planted and worked accordingly, and then the price turns out to be low. But given that you have the low price, I don't see why you can't sell, sell the output at that point. To me, it would be an unusual situation. I mean, maybe there's more complicated things kind of further upstream. You've got the grain elevator that's deciding, should we store it? Maybe the price will change or something like that. But and of course, literally in the agricultural example, you've got kind of this lag time. You make a production decision, and the price is actually realized later on. But the notion of, so maybe that's fair in the broad sense. What's happening in the broader market, it's not preventing you from selling your corn, but the fact that demand, changed at some level, could be a factor.
If the price level is above the equilibrium price level, then you would expect,
Oh, I
from
see.
a neoclassical point of view, that you produce too much corn and have a shortage of demand. So
If the price is above the equilibrium, right? So I guess I'm implicitly assuming that's not true. I think in the corn market, like prices are flexible, they move all the time. We've got the Chicago Board of Trade and other places where they're setting these prices minute by minute in some respects. So broadly thinking the market clears. Again, there may be these kind of complicated inventory decisions. I'm actually, one thing that comes to mind a little bit more interesting in this context, maybe not, agriculture is probably pretty interesting, but I was thinking of the oil markets, where you've got kind of a similar thing. I mean, oil is not exactly the same depending on where it comes out and things along those lines, but it's a world market, and you've got all this complicated decisions people make about inventories and holding them and moving them back and things along those lines. So to some extent, I'm trivializing the agricultural market or the oil market to suggest it's this way. So in a way, I'm in the kind of pure perfect competition world where production is more or less instantaneous, price is taken as given. But you're right. The underlying assumption is that the price is adjusted so that the aggregate market clears.
I think, I'm not from economics in this case, but I thought when I saw this model and the demand shock that is brought up in the article,
Right.
then because I live in Gothenburg, it's where Volvo is in Sweden, and in the third quarter of 2008, it was a demand shock.
I couldn't agree more.
Actually so big that Volvo sold minus 20 in that quarter. They usually sell 20,000 trucks every quarter.
So trucks came back, right? Trucks came back. Yeah.
They have already been purchased.
Right.
You know, so, and that's kind of very true. That perhaps the most
Well, so I can't be happier, right? Let me just quote you again, just make sure it comes across on the microphone. That proved the correctness of the model. In that demand shock. No, and I'm glad you make that point because, again, maybe I'm taking too much time with my happy little, side comments. But when I teach this topic in a full-blown course, when I have more time, I will typically. I'll typically motivate this. And where did I start this? I grew up, my father worked for a foundry. You make castings, you pour hot metal into it, and you make parts that go into engines and other kinds of things like that. It's a very cyclical business, pretty competitive, although imperfectly so, in the sense there's lots of small, in the U.S. Midwest, a lot of small businesses that produce this. And it was just immediately obvious to me that what was driving their business was how much they could sell. And so, I'm kind of remembering I was just coming out of graduate school in the early 1980s. It literally came out in 1982, which was the depth of the big recession in the U.S. prior to this most recent time in the post-war period. And it really decimated this kind of heavy smokestack industry in the U.S. Midwest. And it was clear to me it was demand. Volvo, it was clear it was demand. And then you go into my graduate lectures, and I've got marginal cost equals price and all this kind of stuff. And nobody's talking demand. Nobody's talking demand. I mean, if there was one reason I got interested in doing Keynesian macroeconomics, it would be this. It's observing these kinds of things, saying it is demand shocks that are driving around these firms.
It doesn't matter if they would have lowered the price to half.
Right.
They would not have sold the
Right. Yeah.
So real-world example of a real demand shock would illuminate the model showing the correctness of it, because they could not lay off people until after the demand shock. they could not sell. They could not sell their trucks, even though they would have lowered.
Yeah, no, that's right. And actually, when I think about my father's business, they might have been able to sell more if they lower their price. I mean, that wasn't entirely impossible. Now, my guess is Volvo might have been able to sell more trucks relative to Mercedes or relative to GMC or other people that are making these trucks if they lowered their price by much. But I mean, and this is moving us to the macro side of it. But this really, they're fighting about market share, so.
That quarter, they could not.
In that particular quarter, maybe nobody could have, I agree.
That's the other part of the question, the time lag. You brought it up as
Yeah.
well. I mean, the time lag in it, I would like you to comment on that. I mean, how you...
Well, so let me, this is an interesting discussion, but in the interest of moving things forward, I'll comment on the time lag by saying that in some sense it doesn't exist. Again, this is somewhat the response over here on true perfect competition versus models that have production lags and things like that. But firms are price takers, but they're forecasting price and doing these kinds of things. And kind of heavy industry here, things take some time to produce, and their inventories. There are a lot of kinds of things. The simple model is abstracting from all those things, but I think it does capture that basic story. In fact, let me move to the next diagram, and you can see the graphics are getting prettier. Yes, go ahead, Kristen. Yeah, sure.
So the little e, right?
Right.
It increases or decreases the steepness of the FM curve, right?
That's a good question. Well, so what it does, I mean, if I was graphing the marginal productivity on this graph, it would be every place higher. It's a proportional shift. So if this were logs, if it were in logarithms, it would be a parallel shift. So if it's not logarithms, it's going to be, if we're actually looking levels, sorry, didn't work out doing what I wanted to do. I usually draw it getting kind of steeper. That is, because I think you know what it would do? It would bisect. Like if it was a half, then the marginal productivity would be double. So it would actually get flatter, as you move out. I mean, the FM curve is flatter than the marginal productivity of curve. In a sense, that's kind of obvious because you're taking a number less than 1 and multiplying the slope. If MPL starts out linear, you're multiplying it by something less than 1.
Okay, but that wouldn't change the equilibrium position per se. So,
okay, it does. It does change the equilibrium position. I mean, if it's not one of the things, this is why having a blackboard, I could do it. Since it's all hardwired here, I can't do it, so I'll just talk you through it. So if you shift the FM curve, the equilibrium is going to change. So if you thought about comparing a low E to a high E world, why is that? This was actually interesting if you want a little insight into the research process. So I'm trying to understand, Volvo in 2008 in working through this model. And at one point said, oh, this looks pretty interesting. I'm seeing this kind of thing that looks like a demand curve for labor has got this extra parameter into it, and maybe that parameter is an interesting factor. Well, this E term then shocks to the E. If changes to demand somehow affected E, this would be okay. And indeed, the first kind of algebraic version I wrote this down, it was true. And why? Because for just simple, kind of make my life simple in some respects, to work through some simple cases, I just assumed a linear demand curve. And what do we know about linear demand curves? They do not have constant elasticity. So as you move along them, the elasticity changes, which meant E changed. And I thought, oh, this looks interesting. I'm getting this kind of effect. And realized it was entirely the typical kind of inefficiency of imperfect competition. So if you do standard textbook micro, and you say, let's assume the industry is perfectly competitive, and you solve for industry level quantity, you'll get some number. And now you say, let's suppose the same industry with the same technology has imperfectly competitive firms, and what do you find? You're not where price equals marginal cost anymore. You get a smaller amount of output, the kind of standard result, the inefficiency of monopoly. That's what's here. So what you're seeing is as you move this curve inward, you're going to reduce output, but it'll be basically that response. It'll be that micro incentive to produce less to prevent the price from dropping as much. That is the kind of standard monopoly produces less than perfect competition result, which is a perfectly interesting economic result, but not Keynesian macroeconomics. And in fact, when we started to think about generalizing away from the linear demand curve, of course the first one would be constant elasticity demand curve, which has a constant elasticity, in which case E is constant. If we but there was other literature on there. I'm thinking of, it's actually talked about in the paper, about people who talked about markup changes, systematic markup changes across the business cycle. And my sense of looking at some of those papers was that the argument can go either way, which is you can have kind of positive demand shocks be associated with markups that go up or down depending on the story you tell. And it just wasn't a very robust way of motivating the Volvo example. It really was about things that, from my point of view, were second order in this context. But you're right, it would be wrong to say that the E doesn't matter in that sense. The equilibrium, that's one of the parameters of the equilibrium for sure. Okay, so the next factor here is to actually put it, so this is 2008, 2009. This is a negative demand shock in this context. So, again, just the mechanics is a downward shift of demand means, in a sense, a shift towards the origin, because that's the origin is zero. So for a given price level, less demand is the vertical way of doing it here. And I've worked out the two boxes. You can just kind of watch and see in the direction that all the endogenous variables move. Employment goes down, output goes down, price goes down, and the real wage goes up. And you move from equilibrium labeled A to equilibrium labeled B. Okay, that's all kind of nice and mechanistic. Notice here, and this is important, this is what we're about to talk about in a way, that the wage rate here is constant. I didn't emphasize that so much in the previous diagram, but this is all still in the world of a given wage. So that's implicit, and people, of course, are going to be asking about that, and I'm about to move in that direction. The other thing I've done here, which I did not have, is you'll notice here, and I should have probably emphasized this, are we at full employment? Who knows, right? The general equilibrium is determined without any reference to at least labor supply. The capital stock is implicit here, but labor supply is not there. In this version, I've added a labor supply curve, a traditional, what you like, make it vertical, make it, you could talk about different kinds of foundations for it, but some notion of the number of people who want to work as a function of the wage. And so here, just by assumption, I'm starting at full employment at equilibrium A, and then the negative demand shock pushes you away from full employment. So this looks very much like the kind of results you'd get from a basic Keynesian model. Counter-cyclical real wage with the real wage rising and with a negative demand shock, but less output, less employment. Maybe to pass the microphone down.
I mean, that was what I was going to say. Like, how would you explain the counter-cyclicality of the real wage, which is empirical, not observed?
I'm glad you asked the question, because I'm going to look ahead here. I think it's 1 or 2 slides. I will explain it. But I'm glad we emphasize that, right? I agree with you. Empirically, it tends not to be observed. When people look really, really hard, sometimes they can find it. But this is a pretty basic result, right? If Keynesian macro is to be held, is to make, if this is the whole story, we really ought to see according to this picture, a counter-cyclical real wage. And Keynes himself indicated that. Now there was if people are aware of the literature, and I don't want to present myself as a great expositor of history of thought, but there was the Dunlop and Tarshis business after Keynes, very soon after Keynes, pointing this out. And Keynes said, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. But I'll come back and address this. I'll address this again. You're right. It is an implication. Okay, so this is kind of the sticky wage. If we were in mainstream world, and really there's nothing I've said here, I want to be clear about this. So, sometimes I'm presenting myself as a heterodox Keynesian, a post-Keynesian, a fundamentalist Keynesian, an intrinsic Keynesian. I'll pick my label depending on my mood. But everything but a mainstream Keynesian, but nothing I've said so far, except for maybe some of the introductory results, is inconsistent with mainstream Keynesian macro. This is a textbook model generalized to imperfect competition. It's just a different way of looking at things, but I think a helpful way of looking at things. And you'd say, well, there's a sticky wage here. Of course you're going to get, if you're taking a mainstream perspective, if the wage doesn't adjust, of course you're going to get a problem. In fact, what happens when the wage adjusts? So this is wage and price adjustment to restore full employment. I'm now can be modest about my slides because I forgot a parenthesis up there. Okay, so the idea here was B is the same B from the previous one after the negative demand shock. And now what happens? What happens is that wages and prices fall. Well, let me put it this way, the wages fall. So maybe another small digression, I should watch the time here a little bit. Another small digression is that mainstream macro, especially the more modern version of new Keynesian macro, tends to emphasize price stickiness over wage stickiness. I've always considered that kind of surprising. That is, I'm kind of medium neutral on these issues in terms of are prices sticky, are wages sticky. But if one of them is sticky, it's almost certainly wages. And so I've always thought it's a little odd that the new Keynesian attempt to provide micro foundations for nominal rigidity went in the direction of focusing on prices. I think your point over here is kind of the reason, because wage stickiness almost certainly gets you this counter-cyclical real wage, which didn't really work, and price stickiness doesn't really have to. But to my mind, that makes it seem even more, that whole research program a little more marginal, because the price stickiness, especially in the more modern world, I think is a bit hard to motivate. And my general view is if firms want to change prices, they'll change prices. There may be strategic reasons for them not to. I've never taken the menu cost stuff too seriously, and even if you did, most restaurants I go to, at least better ones, they print the menu every day anyway, whether they change the price or not. So it just doesn't seem to be, in my mind, a very fruitful research direction to move on the price stickiness side. But if you take a more traditional sticky, oh, go ahead, Xiao.
Mostly because of the like debt deflation problem.
Yeah, everything you're saying is about to come. So I mean, that's a trivial answer there, but maybe we should, in the interest of time, we'll move in that direction. Here's the kind of neoclassical synthesis. After the negative demand shock, you have the unemployment at point B. Unemployment eventually eventually puts downward pressure on the money wage. How do you model that in this framework? As a downward shift of this curve. And as the wage rate falls, the equilibrium moves, and you move back to full employment. But let me emphasize, I think it's probably on the next slide, but I'll say it here, and then we can summarize it when I flip the slides, that this is absolutely critical, and the comment here starts to suggest of where the issue is. So, look, the problem at point B is insufficient demand. I want to emphasize that. You could say, well, the problem is a sticky wage. This becomes the kind of subtle interpretation. But why are firms producing less? Here, as we move from A to B, why are firms producing less? Because there's less demand. Now, it's true the wage rate is sticky, but now we have to say, well, what happens if unemployment puts downward pressure on money wages? Well, we move back to full employment, but you see the lower wage does what? It makes firms optimally cut prices, because if you just cut the wage only and didn't change anything else, the firm still wants this W over P. They want to stay on the FM curve. So if you cut wages, firms will optimally choose to cut prices. When they cut prices, and this is the critical point, it actually raises demand. It solves if the problem is insufficient demand, cutting prices raises demand. And so in some ways, opposite of the Volvo example, they cut prices that wouldn't have helped. The assumption here, and it's an assumption, is that lower prices actually do raise demand, and then that solves the problem. And the process, the wage and price adjustment process, goes on until there's no longer downward pressure on money wages, and you get back to full employment. So there is a substantive role for demand. Demand constraints matter. Firms produce less when they sell less, but the wage and price adjustment process, if it leads to unemployment, falling wages, falling prices, brings us back to full employment. So let's just, here's the summary in words. See if there's anything to add additionally here. One is just to think about these things. This may be the one point on this slide I want to emphasize. The two necessary conditions. So the neoclassical synthesis, Keynesian results in the short run, converge to full employment, classical results in the long run, require, in my view, two necessary conditions. One is that unemployment will eventually put downward pressure on wages that causes prices to fall. That's standard, and that's the whole sticky wage issue. If you somehow cut this off, you don't get immediately back to full employment. The second one is that when prices fall, aggregate demand rises. This is the one that's much less discussed. You won't see this broadly discussed. Nobody really talks about it. It is typically implicit. I've looked at textbooks just to see where it is. There'll be some hand waving about real balance effects and things like this, but it's really not emphasized and nor particularly questioned. With some minor exceptions, maybe not so minor exceptions, with some exceptions, if I think about the whole project of new Keynesian macroeconomics, which is to try to provide so-called rigorous optimizing micro foundations for Keynesian macro, virtually no attention to this issue, lots of attention to this issue. Why might wages be sticky? In particular, why might prices be sticky? But no attention to to speak of to this issue. Now, I want to emphasize here, and the Volvo example becomes a bit of a, kind of meme that comes through all this discussion, that condition 2, the fall in price that raises aggregate demand, is not about firm behavior. This is an externality. This is that if all firms did was cut their individual prices and competed against each other, they would just compete for market share, but they wouldn't raise the market as a whole. That is, no firm is, some people will argue with me, but let me just state it this way. No firm is cutting price as an attempt to raise aggregate demand. Firms cut price to raise their own demand. But the only way the neoclassical synthesis is going to work is if it raises aggregate demand. If Volvo sells more trucks and Mercedes sells less trucks, employment may shift between Sweden and Germany, but it's not. But there's no increase in employment in the after. We need somehow to spill this over to the economy as a whole, so there's more demand for trucks or goods and services in general as prices fall. Can't even remember exactly what points on this I have in there, but the typical story would be something like this: that a lower price level for a given money supply, raises real money balances, and that has wealth effects on, encourages people to spend more, or that's the so-called Pigou effect, or the Keynes effect, that raising real money balances or lowering prices and lowering the demand for nominal money would lower interest rates and encourage spending that way. Both, in my view, pretty weak reads upon which to build an entire macroeconomic theory, but that's the kind of textbook story for why the aggregate demand curve might slope downward, why condition number 2 might hold. But this is not about firm behavior. One of the things that I've really emphasized, it's a simple point, but I want to emphasize it for this group, is that every time I talk about this, that it seems natural to students of economics. Prices fall, people buy more. Don't we know demand curves slope downward? Isn't like this the first lecture of introductory microeconomics, that people buy more when prices fall? And if you're talking about apples and oranges, yes, but you've got the kind of income effect and the substitution effect, the Slutsky equation. And broadly speaking, people say, well, if the price of apples is lower relative to oranges, maybe I should buy a few more apples and substitute away. And if I was buying apples before, my real income in some broad sense has risen, so maybe I'll buy even more apples if they're a normal good. That's the income effect. But this is entirely microeconomics. If the price of everything is falling, well, what do you substitute from, towards? If the price of everything is falling, so is the income of everybody, the money income, and so there is no, in some sense, income effect. I mean, we could talk about international trade and other more complicated channels, but broadly speaking, the simple intuition that microeconomic demand curves slope downward does not carry over to the idea that aggregate demand curves slope downward. And this, just a kind of almost socio-psychological comment. Is this why macroeconomists don't think too hard about this issue typically? Just because they like drawing downward sloping demand curves? I have a paper written in 1987 that has an upward sloping demand curve. But it was, kind of hard to draw. It took a lot of work. And I didn't have all this fancy graphics to do it back in the days. So maybe that's why they don't think so hard about it. But it seems natural, but it shouldn't be taken as natural. This is an important assumption. All right. Here's where we go into this. So the kind of textbook interpretation, everybody says, look, the first, focuses on the first condition, but it's the second condition, the link between price and aggregate demand, that ultimately drives the results here. And I want to talk about it. Debt deflation just came up in the comment a few minutes ago. So I want to talk about 3 reasons to criticize this view, 3 different kinds of channels very broadly. All of them could deserve a very detailed discussion. The first one is expectations. So, and Keynes himself talks about this. That is when, if prices are falling, does that encourage people to buy more in general or less? Well, it kind of depends, doesn't it? If you think the price is falling temporarily, you'd say it's a good time to buy. If you think today's price decline is a signal of future price declines, you'll be inclined to put off purchases. And the way that I've actually implemented this in some of the earlier work I did on this topic was by thinking in terms of price flexibility more broadly. If you take a textbook neoclassical synthesis view, the idea would be the economy would be more stable, to focus on the stability-instability theme of these lectures. The economy would be more stable if prices are more flexible. Prices adjust faster. But in a way, if prices adjust faster, then people expect them to adjust faster, which actually is destabilizing in this context, because that it says if we have a more flexible model, then once we see a negative demand shock, we think prices are going to fall more. There's an incentive for us to defer demand and also, in a sense, raise real interest rates. When I hesitated before to say there was no mainstream work on this topic, there is a 1986 paper, I believe, by Brad DeLong and Larry Summers, pretty prominent mainstream economists, although DeLong has maybe come over to the other side to some extent in recent years. Who knows where Summers is. And they emphasize this point, that actually this expectational channel can, and they say it explicitly, can say that wage and price flexibility is destabilizing. All this stuff, by the way, is cited in the paper that was distributed. One that I find a little more interesting personally is this redistribution point, which is that as prices fall, if you have nominal debt contracts, you're redistributing between borrowers and lenders. In fact, you're redistributing away from lenders, away from borrowers towards lenders. If I owe money, the value of my liabilities go up. If I owe $100, the value of that's rising. If I am owed $100, the value of that's also rising. So the value of the asset goes up, but so does the value of the liability. And actually, I just saw this recently, and I can't remember where, but I know I just saw it recently. A quote from Ben Bernanke about this notion. Well, this stuff really shouldn't matter because it's just distributional. It's just redistributing wealth back and forth. But think about this from a demand perspective. Why do people borrow money? Why do people lend money? You borrow money because you spend more than your income. You lend money because you spend less than your income. It seems unusual to assume that redistribution is neutral with respect to spending in that context. A falling price level in a world of nominal debt contracts is redistributing money, wealth away from spenders towards savers. I think the natural assumption here is that would tend to reduce demand. This, by the way, was emphasized by Jim Tobin back in the 1970s. And then finally, there's the whole debt deflation factor, which probably is the most important one, which is, it's not quite the same as the redistribution, but it's broadly speaking that, look, if you've got nominal debt contracts and prices and wages, the prices are falling in general in the aggregate, it becomes harder for people to make their nominal payments. Margins of safety shrink, to give a Hyman Minsky way of talking about this, and it becomes the threat of bankruptcy rises. People tighten their belts to try to avoid bankruptcy. Even if the borrowers don't want to avoid bankruptcy, the lenders will force them to tighten their belts by not giving them as much credit going forward. So you have a generalized, the possibility of financial crisis and financial instability rises. Well-known things. Fisher effects, going back to his famous paper from the 1930s, and then Minsky and others talking along these lines. So, these all are different reasons to criticize this view that falling prices stimulate aggregate demand. And this is an interesting topic, and I'd be happy to spend more time on it that we don't really fully have. But so I guess I don't want to put too much time. But I would say that both evidence and practical kind of policy supports this. It's inconsistent with. It supports the more radical view, the non-standard view. It's inconsistent with the standard textbook assumption. The practical monetary policy consideration I have in mind is, how many central bankers around the world think that deflation's a good thing? I'm sure you'll find some, but they're probably not too many. I know Ben Bernanke's not one of them. He's been very clear about that. Alan Greenspan wasn't. Sorry for being so U.S. focused, but in general, people try to avoid deflation. Central bankers try to avoid deflation. So I had this question for myself. Well, Ben Bernanke in his earlier incarnation, wrote a textbook with Andrew Abel, a very well-known, prominently used intermediate macro textbook in the United States and probably elsewhere. What does it say about deflation? And it says the faster prices fall, the quicker you converge back to full employment. And I thought, well, but that's not the way he talks. And as a policymaker, it's not the way he behaves. There's just an inconsistency. Should be a little bit careful. This is going on the web someday. Here I'm going to. Ben Bernanke's got bigger things to worry about than whether I diss his textbook. But the point, I've always considered this a conundrum. I've been talking about these issues since the middle 1980s, and been at conferences with mainstream discussants and things like that, and say, yeah, we agree with you. Falling wages and prices do not raise demand. They do not stabilize the economy. At least, deflation's a bad thing. We should avoid it. But then, why is every undergraduate and probably most graduate students that address these issues at all, taught that the whole problem is wage and price rigidity, and if wage and prices adjust faster, we get back to full employment faster? I just don't get it. I think it's a disconnect, a fundamental disconnect in mainstream macroeconomics. Please explain it to all of me, or explain all of it to me. In theory, we don't have debt. Yeah, okay. So, but in theory, we don't have debt, so we can ignore this. We abstract from this. But then when we actually have to deal with the real world, we can't ignore the debt. And so, you know, kind of sensible people say we better not have deflation. But I don't know. I guess I wouldn't be very happy to think of the intermediate macro course that has been taught to thousands, tens of thousands of motivated students around the world, you know, saying, well, this really isn't relevant to the world, but it's a nice model. It is a very nice model. It's a very nice model. In teaching introductory macroeconomics, something I've done a lot over the years, I did the basic aggregate supply and demand model, converged, neoclassical synthesis, converge back to full employment. As wages and prices fall, when there's unemployment, for probably the first half to 2/3 of my 30 years of teaching. And I just said heck with it after a while. You know, nobody believes this is the way it works in practice. My students have better things to do than learn this model. I mean, my graduate students or other students, they should know it because they should get these ideas put together, right? But at the introductory level, falling wages and prices is not a practical path back to full employment. People generally agree with that, so it shouldn't in some ways be so controversial. I've actually tried to do more systematic empirical work on this topic. I have actually a paper, I think published in '93, it would be cited in the '98 paper, which is more kind of a calibration model, trying to put some quantities on these various channels and see which they work out. The result is interesting. I'll summarize it very, very quickly. The result is basically this, that the destabilizing channels dominate the stabilizing channels, so that if you just kind of have the benchmark parameters, more flexible prices, in this case a steeper sloped Phillips curve, so that the prices respond, inflation responds more quickly to unemployment, leads to modestly less stability. But let me emphasize modest. It turned out just like those parameter values didn't make much difference. That basically, you know, demand was kind of independent of the way in which inflation adjusted in response to unemployment. And so the destabilizing channels did dominate the stabilizing channels, but that was only because the stabilizing channels were so weak that they really didn't do very much. The destabilizing channels, at least with the parameters we chose, were not particularly overwhelming. It's just they didn't have much to overcome. So the point being that, broadly speaking, aggregate demand, you know, in this kind of static context of this diagram, is pretty insensitive to price. That would have been the result broadly, but certainly doesn't go the other direction. So this is where we go here, which is the last version of the model. The model in the spirit of Keynes, as the final section of the '98 paper emphasizes. And so there's two things here. So I'm going to do this backwards. I've just given you evidence that aggregate demand in this context should be flat. So here's the picture. See, it is what it is. Doesn't matter what happens to price. So the first approximation, changes in prices, no big deal. Second thing, countercyclical real wages. So this imperfect competition gives me an additional kind of degree of freedom in the model, which actually, this is a more or less mainstream point, but it's potentially pretty, I mean, it's kind of a technical point, maybe not so important for really understanding the world, but it helps sort through some debates in the literature. So the countercyclical real wage is inconsistent with evidence. I agree with that. In fact, it's maybe a bigger deal in some ways. I don't know if people are familiar with some of the macro debates of probably the 1980s mostly. So in the debate between real business cycle technology shocks and some kind of Keynesian price stickies, the mainstream price sticky Keynesian models, there was a lot made of this issue. Because the sticky price Keynesian models gave this countercyclical real wage prediction. If you think that technology shocks are driving the economy, you'll get procyclical real wages. I mean, basically it would be, go back to the diagram here, that the FM curve is wiggling around. So a recession is a negative technology shock that shifts the FM curve inward and shifts the production function up, towards the origin here. So basically employment would vary along the labor supply curve. It's why the real business cycle models have a lot of trouble with the fact that labor supply is not very wage elastic. At least a lot of estimates suggest that because they can't get much of a business cycle, and so they work hard to find stories that would make labor supply flat. So these technology shocks that move the demand curve around can generate realistic employment fluctuations. But anyway, the real business cycle story says pro-cyclical real wages. The Keynesian story says counter-cyclical real wages. The evidence, in my view, says acyclical real wages. They just don't vary. I just pulled the data down from my class like a week ago, and there's real wage has some trends in it, some 10-year kind of dynamics towards it, but virtually nothing at business cycle frequencies, just random noise as far as I could tell, and And so there's basically acyclical real wages. Well, so where does this counter-cyclical real wage prediction come from in the basic kind of mainstream Keynesian model? It comes from that downward sloping FM curve. It comes from the fact that the marginal productivity of labor declines when employment rises. So relevant range of employment, we get non-trivial changes in the marginal productivity of labor. Is that true? I don't know. I actually looked a little bit at literature on this. Some people have found that marginal costs are more or less flat across the business cycle. There's some people even have kind of increasing returns models which would suggest the other direction. Why is it that there's this kind of ubiquitous assumption of declining marginal productivity? Well, if you have perfect competition, you'll have no theory of the firm. Because think of perfect competition. Price equals marginal cost. If marginal productivity is constant, marginal cost is going to be constant for a given wage. If you have a horizontal price level and a horizontal marginal cost curve, they're never going to cross. And so there is no theory of the firm. The whole micro foundations kind of falls apart. But once you have imperfect competition, it's not true anymore. You can have constant marginal cost, marginal revenue declines. They intersect. So in a world of imperfect competition, it makes perfect sense to draw the FM curve flat. And I'm not going to make a strong empirical. I think there is some empirical evidence for this. All I'm saying in terms of people actually looking at marginal cost and how it varies across the business cycle. But the point is it's consistent with the real wage behavior. That is that this is a model that actually does square with the evidence in this regard and eliminates that typical criticism that, well, this Keynesian story should imply a counter-cyclical real wage. It also suggests if you want a sticky nominal stickiness model, you can just as well get it from nominal wage stickiness as nominal price stickiness. But I probably shouldn't emphasize that too much, especially because I'm watching the time click away. So here's the here's the basic, kind of model in the spirit of Keynes, the intrinsic role of demand. And you can see that here now demand is really determining pretty much everything. Wages can fall when there's unemployment as the equilibrium from B to C. So we start again at A, full employment, negative demand shock to B. Wages fall, moving to C, but it just doesn't do us any good because we've kind of chopped off that aggregate demand externality. Falling prices do not solve the problem of insufficient demand. And we get this back here. Another interesting thing about looking at this model is that you say it's not about the distortion in the real wage. That is, I mean, again, just to compare, sorry to jump so much, but here you could say, well, look, the problem is the real wage is too high. And in fact, we need wages to fall, right? We have unemployment. Wages have to fall. That's really microeconomic thinking. It's not thinking in a more macro context. Now, it's kind of true in this model because that's the way it works in some respects, that with this declining FM curve, that's what the equilibrium looks like. So there is a sense in which you could say the real wage is distorted relative to its classical full employment level. But this, it is a special case, but the special case of a flat FM curve shows that's not necessary. That, if this is a perfectly sensible model with imperfect competition, and there's no distortion of the real wage whatsoever. Why? Because the problem isn't the real wage. The problem is demand. I would even argue in this picture, the problem is basically demand. It's just that the general equilibrium makes it look, makes it appear in this quadrant as emerging in the real wage. Now, another aspect of the point that I'm getting, or the kind of way I'm talking about this right now, is you can see why this framework makes sense. Because these kind of subtleties emerge that you would not see if you did this in textbook aggregate supply and aggregate demand space. It is kind of the same model. I'm not denying that. But it starts to let you talk about these nuances in ways that are not nearly as evident in the more traditional textbook approach. So the model in the spirit of Keynes is this. What's going on? Well, the demand constraints are intrinsic. That is, so we're going to end this first part where we started, the idea that demand is really what is driving production. It's really evident in this context. In some respects, if you accept this as a kind of empirically justified, both empirically and theoretically consistent model, that you kind of don't need the picture anymore, because boy, once you know what's happening here, you know pretty much everything else. And the productivity relationship will tell you what happens over here. You might be interested in real wages and this kind of stuff. So I don't want to suggest that the model is or the picture is completely useless. But it really says if you want to understand macroeconomics, you got to understand demand, because that's really what's driving things, in this context. And this is this notion that demand really is intrinsic. It's at the very heart of the issue. This does not require nominal stickiness. It does not require nominal stickiness, although nominal stickiness is sufficient in some respects. That is, I'm not going to deny, I mean, there's a logical consistency to the basic mainstream Keynesian interpretation. You have sticky wages, other things equal, you know, demand there'll be demand effects, but it's not necessary. And certainly the implication of the model is not necessarily that more flexible wages and prices will stabilize the system. In fact, I would argue just the opposite. So what this suggests is if we want to understand kind of macroeconomic instability, we need to understand the dynamics of demand. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the second part. There's a question here. Maybe we talk about it during the break, okay? That might be it. So let's, it's according to this, I think 3:17. So we'll plan to start here about 3:30, okay? Maybe, well, 3:35. Yep. Okay. So maybe we'll have a few people come back, or maybe I lost a few people after the first session. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and move to a bit of a different approach. So this is more like a more traditional research seminar. What you heard from me before was kind of an amalgamation of probably about 5 or 6 different lectures that kind of got put in the direction, lectures that I would at some level give to advanced undergraduates, but as the kind of aura of this room came together, my level moved more to the doctoral level, is the way I've taught that to doctoral students over the years. Now we'll move into more of a traditional research seminar perspective, but one that is motivated by the kind of ending point of the first part, this notion that if there's instability, that instability really is going to be generated by demand. And so I should recognize here a little more explicitly, actually I've still got my PISA lectures on here. This is actually modified, not PISA lectures. It should say INET. In fact, I hope I got the right one. Let me just check the, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, okay, it says INET. I should, excuse me just a second. All right, I think it's the right one. Hopefully I just forgot to edit the title slide. All right, so recognize my co-authors, Piero Fazzari, Edward Greenberg, my colleague at Washington University, and Anna Maria Valiato, also of the University of Bergamo in Italy. So this is a paper we've been working on for a while, and it is actually coming out in the Review of Keynesian Economics. Good point. So in principle I could do it, but we'll let the expert do it. Oh, I had to make a full screen? I could do that. All right, sorry. Okay, so here we are with the intrinsic Keynesian model. This is what I'm calling it these days. And actually, once again, in the little comment here on the slide sends me right away into a bit of a digression. So in teaching these issues at any level, at least beyond the introductory macro level, so more advanced undergraduate macro seminars and also graduate macro, I've generally talked in terms of, over my career, in terms of 3 models. A classical full employment model, new classical model, and a mainstream Keynesian model, which would be the kind of sticky price, neoclassical synthesis, short-run Keynesian, long-run classical. And then the third model, which is of course the one that I have subscribed to, but I don't know what to call it. And for many years I called it the radical Keynesian model. And that kind of felt good in a way. It's nice to be think of yourself, I don't know, is it nice to think of yourself as radical? I'm not entirely sure. But I felt like at least it was provocative, if nothing else. And but then, especially as I started to talk about it, the things you've heard me talk about in the first part of the lecture, it isn't so radical. I mean, there's nothing terribly radical about it, right? This idea, the most radical piece is to say that wage and price flexibility is not stabilizing. But as I indicate, at least even if they talk differently or the textbook suggests differently, virtually every central banker in the world seems to accept this, which can't make it very radical. I was talking to Sebastian at the break, and the Germans don't, but otherwise, you know, pretty much other central banks think that deflation is a bad thing. So I'm not so sure how radical it really is in some respects. And so I've come to this notion that maybe it's this intrinsic Keynesian model, with demand being intrinsic. And maybe another way to characterize this view of the world is that demand generation is not automatic, and that something has. It's a substantive part of the economy, and it's a substantive part of the economy beyond the short run. You know, certainly in the basic Say's law classical world, new classical world, you know, demand is just always whatever it needs to be to purchase full employment supply, and we understand everything in terms of the supply side. In the mainstream Keynesian world, you have short-run Keynesian possibilities, but because of nominal rigidity, when wages and prices adjust, you converge to the classical world. So at least if you're talking about growth, if you're talking about anything beyond the short run, the demand generation process is generally assumed automatic. It fades to the background. We don't need to think about it. We want to think about growth over 5 years and longer. You know, do that with growth models which are entirely supply-driven. So the demand generation process in this intrinsic Keynesian model is not automatic. It's something we have to think. It's not that you can ignore the supply side. Supply side matters. You can't produce, you know, industrial economies are producing massively more than they did now than they did 100 years ago. Clearly, a lot of that had to do with the improvements in technology and changes in resources and rising population and all this kind of stuff, accumulation of capital, all the kinds of things that you would typically emphasize from a supply side perspective. But so supply side is certainly necessary, but in a way it's not sufficient. That's my perspective. That the demand process also must be analyzed substantively. We have to understand where it comes from. If we want to think about economic growth, why does demand grow? If you go back to the final diagram of the previous discussion, there was no particularly good reason, right? I mean, demand is what it is. Why should it grow over time? We don't really know. It was just that flat curve. So this is in a way the conundrum that if you take from this static analysis, from this kind of short-run static analysis, this notion that demand is a constraint on production, there's no particular reason why it would grow. Technology could improve, but that would just make labor more productive. If we don't have the demand, higher technology might actually lead to unemployment. The old concern of the Luddites might actually come true in a demand-constrained economy. So there's this kind of question: where does the demand growth come from to generate long-run growth? Long-run growth, long-term growth, does seem to be persistent. And you know, as I say on the slide here, if you think about growth being driven, say, by technology or resource accumulation, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So one possibility, and this is a possibility I remain sympathetic to, even in the context of this paper, which is taking a different view, but I still think there's something to this, that maybe demand growth is to some extent idiosyncratic. It depends on particular historical circumstances in which we get demand growth. Here I'm talking about two different historical circumstances that I'm aware with from the US. Why do we get demand growth in the US? In the 1960s, well, even to the 1950s, the immediate post-World War II period, there was generally really strong wage growth in the US along with technology growth. There was kind of a virtuous circle between improving labor productivity, more productive technology, rising wages, so that the workers, broadly speaking, could buy the greater amount of production that was generated by their technology, and it was kind of feeding each other back and forth in that respect. Now that actually ended, depending on when you look at it, sometime between the middle 1970s and early 1980s. In other papers I've written, not emphasizing at this conference, but other papers I've written, we've talked about what I call the consumer age. Some of you will meet my young co-author here who's attended the conference, Barry Cinnamon, and I sent Barry to go hear about inequality because we want to learn about that. He knows what I'm going to say. But we've written these things where we're talking about the consumer age, a period of time in which consumption is driving demand upwards, but it's doing so with a lot of debt financing and ultimately becomes unsustainable. The simple story being that high consumption but financed by borrowing stimulated the economy for a really quarter-century period from the middle 1980s up till the beginning of the Great Recession in the US. But then that breaks in the context of the Great Recession. That's probably not going to continue, and we will not see that kind of growth regime again. And so here we are. We have a more stagnant economy and more persistent unemployment, and so that we could think of demand growth as being a sequence of these processes that come from different sources. And I I broadly believe there's truth to that explanation, and that's so part of this would be the more traditional analysis of a historian than an economic modeler, is to understand demand growth as the result of particular historical circumstances. But the question here, is there something deeper and more systematic? That over time, that there is some more systematic tendency for demand to push forward, to absorb the resources that are created by the expanding supply side by improving technology, growing populations, and capital accumulation. And so that becomes the question. So let me just give you the vision of this paper, that we're going back to the dynamic Keynesian model of Roy Harrod. And so the original paper was published in 1939. And so forgive the old history of thought here. But the interesting reason to go back to Harrod is he was struggling with this question. You had Keynes' general theory, which had lots of talk about instability and fluctuations, but not a lot of talk about systematic dynamics. And so Harrod was taking these Keynesian ideas, and let me kind of put this in a growth model context. And the results of Harrod, I'll talk more about the details in a few minutes, but one of the results was, well, there is a steady state warranted rate path, but it's unstable. That these kind of basic, a very simple Keynesian dynamic model suggests instability. Now, it's unstable in both directions, sometimes called a knife edge. That is, you're on this steady state path. If you have a negative shock, away you go down to zero. If you have a positive shock, you explode off to infinity. And so that's the result, and Harrod is kind of, talked around and said, well, maybe it's not all that unstable. It's maybe, and there was a whole kind of a literature of dealing with this, but largely, I think people did not consider this a very attractive way to think about the economy. There might be instability, there might be volatility, but this knife edge kind of property seemed extreme. It was too much instability, so to speak. But the vision here is to think about that in a little bit different context. In particular, think about the upward direction. Maybe the reason demand grows over time is because it's unstable. Maybe that this inherent dynamic instability of demand could be, at least in the upward direction, driving the systematic increase in demand over time. So even though it's not automatic, and I at least am skeptical about the wage and price adjustment story to get the economy, to get demand back to the supply side through the more traditional mechanisms, maybe here's an alternative mechanism that is somewhat systematic. Now that does suggest a problem though, so okay, fine, that's a nice story for the top side, but what about the negative instability? Well, there has to be something to contain that as well, and I'll have more to say about this. But what it suggests is that this systematic growth of demand over time is really not an equilibrium or steady state result, but it actually is a fundamentally unstable result, as you'll see as we talk about this. And this is in a way related to this concept of floors and ceilings. John Hicks has some models like this. Hyman Minsky back, I think in the 1960s, is when he published the floors and ceilings paper. We've had kind of Keynesian economists going after these issues before. The ceiling part of this, you'll see in our model, is probably pretty traditional. The floor is a little bit different than the approach that was taken elsewhere. So that's broadly the idea. Now, I want to just kind of emphasize this by way of introduction. It's a bit of a twist on Harrod's theme, because there has been this sense of Harrod's model is in some ways not appropriate, not useful, not empirically valid in a very broad sense, because of this knife edge instability, and so it's kind of a disappointment. You write down this model, it seems like a sensible way to start thinking of Keynesian dynamics, but you get this extreme instability, and so the model seems ultimately to be ineffective at least explaining empirical reality. But here, as I pointed, the twist is instead of disappointment, we think of instability as our friend. That is, actually the instability could help explain this persistent demand growth and ultimately explain why, while we have maybe pretty long periods of stagnation and unemployment, at least occasionally, the modern industrial economies, I'm thinking primarily the U.S., but I think it applies to the rest of at least the developed world as well, occasionally get the full employment. Maybe not all that often. That's what we're going to talk about. So let me just kind of skip the rest of this introduction stuff and get into the basics, but that's the idea. We can interpret it more at the end if we have time. Okay, so here's the basic model. It's really very simple. In many respects, I'm going to put a couple of bells and whistles on the simple Harrod structure, but really I'm following more or less what he did earlier. So Demand drives output unless resources constraint bind. That's the basic story. So broadly speaking, if you think in terms of the 4-quadrant diagram from the previous discussion, it's that demand curve, that flat demand curve moving around through time that's driving the economy. But there is a constraint which was actually implicit in that diagram. That is, should you get to full employment and demand shifts up to more, well, now you're resource constrained. So the output is going to be the minimum of demand in what I'm calling here Y star, where Y star represents potential or full employment output. In the model here, at least the simplest version, following Herod again, we're just going to talk about 2 components of demand, consumption and investment. I'll introduce something that looks like government spending in a little while. Consumption is very simple. It's just a simple function of income, although we do emphasize expectations in this perspective. And so rather than having consumption based on actual income, which is what Herod does, we have consumption based on expected income. So and expectations are formed with 1 period lag information. So the most convenient way is to think about it this way. The consumption is some constant marginal propensity to consumer, 1 minus a marginal propensity to save, times expected income, where expected income by definition is last period's income kind of factored up for expected growth, or factored down if expected growth is negative. So it's a very simple consumption function. I think you can generalize this a little bit to more permanent income kinds of ideas by thinking about how these expectations are formed. I might comment on that a bit later. I should say that this is of course a simple Keynesian consumption function, which would be widely criticized in maybe many places of mainstream economics, but actually it can come from optimizing microfoundations. There is literature where you can, if you start with the right utility function and you maximize, that it actually ends up looking very much like this. So I don't think this is overly restrictive, although I think it could be interesting to generalize to more complicated consumption, especially consumption where there's a financial aspect of it, which is suppressed in this context. On the investment side, how does this work out? Well, investment is motivated by the fact that firms need capital to produce. So we're going to assume a simple Leontief production technology, which actually I believe is maybe implicit in Herod, but he certainly does it. And so this Y star is dependent on employment, which is growing exogenously, or labor supply, which is growing exogenously, productivity, which is growing exogenously, a capital stock, which is actually, I'll talk about, is actually accumulated by investment activities, and a technological constant, the V star, which is the capital output ratio. Again, think about that as a parameter of technology. So investment is accumulated. It's productive with, again, a lag of 1 period. So the desired capital stock is what drives investment. It will be based on this technological coefficient, based on the expectation of future output. And we just kind of work it out this way. So the expectation of future output at the time you're making the period T investment decision depends on period T minus 1 information. So you actually have to kind of pull this expectation of output forward by 2 periods, so you square the expected growth term. In discussing in the paper, or in the process that led up to the paper, we had some discussion about, well, is this restrictive, that we have the same expected growth rate for between period T minus 1 and T and period T and T plus 1, and decided no, it really doesn't make that much difference. I mean, you can just think of EG in this context is the square root of the expected growth rate over 2 periods, or the, whatever. 1 plus EG is the square root of the expected growth factor over 2 periods. Then we're imposing the same expected growth rate on consumption. Again, one could generalize that. I don't think it would make much difference in the result. I was asked to, could we use the microphone? I'm happy to take a question, but let's.
I can raise my voice.
Let's do the microphone. We can pass it around here.
So just to clarify, now we don't have a well-defined labor demand, right?
We don't have, excuse me?
A well-defined labor demand function. So shifting away from the diagram to...
Yes. So the well-defined labor demand function. So labor demand here will be generated, output is consumption plus investment. Mm-hmm. And then labor demand would be output divided by the productivity of labor.
All right.
So actually, it is literally the final picture of the previous thing. And why? I didn't really emphasize this, but when I made the FM curve flat to deal with the acyclical real wage, you could do that a variety of ways, but the way that I think is most sensible is to just assume constant marginal cost, which is basically assuming linear production. So I didn't really emphasize it, but I actually drew the production function as a straight line. So it's literally a Leontief kind of thing in terms of, I mean, that wasn't really emphasized in terms of labor and capital, but the labor side of it would be identical.
But this is going to be the average productivity of labor, not the marginal productivity.
Yes, well, they're the same. I mean, in
Yeah,
some
in this-
respects,
yeah.
you're right. You're right. That's true. Which reminds me, I should probably tell you, because you do have the published version of the 1998 paper, so I blew it in the 1998 paper. If you look at the final diagram, the model in the spirit of Keynes, the production function is not linear. It's a sustained production function. I think it was one of my smart graduate students, and they said, wait a second, if you assume constant marginal cost, shouldn't the production function be linear? I said, yes. So I've learned my lesson, but did not correct it in time for publication, so I apologize for that. I was bragging about my diagrams before. Now this is the humble part of my lecture. Okay, so all right. So what else is going on here? So this is the desired capital stock, and that gives us an investment function as the difference between the desired capital stock in period t plus 1, the actual capital stock period t, adjusting for depreciation. This just plugs in the relevant. Just expands those terms and that equation. So that's investment. We talked consumption on the previous slide. All right, so let's look at basic growth dynamics. So one thing here, just to step back a little bit from the stepping through all the equations, that kind of vision of this way of working, at least when I think about building this model, it's a notion of sitting at period t minus 1 and moving forward to period t and then moving forward to period t plus 1. So what I'm trying to do is think about how it is the conditions today affect the way the demand will move tomorrow. So it's just kind of marching these equations forward in time is the way I want to think about it. So you'll notice this equation here for output period t, everything on the right-hand side is either predetermined or literally t minus 1. So here's a t variable, kt, but kt is the result of investment activities taking place in t minus 1. Here's EGT is the expectation of growth between period t minus 1 and period t determined in period t minus 1, or based on information available through period t minus 1. Again, there's standard notation for that would just complicate things here. But this is, the model is recursive in that sense, which is something we tried to do. As a bit of a technical note, that's why actually in our model, consumptions are based on expected income rather than actual income. In Herod's model, he kind of solves out for the Keynesian multiplier period by period. We kind of let it evolve through time. Probably doesn't make a huge difference in the results, but I find it more attractive to have this sense of a true dynamic path through time. This second equation here just divides everything through by yt minus 1. So we write this now as an equation in rates of growth. So now we have a law of motion for the growth rate in the economy, which depends on this expectation. It depends on this kind of capital output ratio, but notice the time subscripts are a bit different there. We have to account for that. And basically the demand parameters, the marginal propensity to consume, 1 minus S. And you can think of V star, while it's a technological parameter, it's also a demand parameter. It tells you how much investment is necessary for a given amount of growth to provide the desired capital stock. So conditional on these expectations, this gives a law of motion for growth with another, the expectations kind of a state variable as well as this capital output ratio. And one thing I want to point out here, this will seem obvious, but it'll be clear why I emphasize it, is the Keynesian features here. More demand, more growth. You have a higher marginal propensity to consume, you get bigger growth. You have more investment for a given amount of expected growth, you get bigger, you get bigger actual growth. That higher demand generates more growth. No big surprise there, but you'll see why that's important in a minute. Okay, now let's talk about the steady state. So this model has a steady state growth rate. I'm not showing the algebra. It's not complicated. It's straightforward. But if we set actual growth equal to expected growth equal to the steady state rate, we set the capital output ratio equal to the desired technological, the actual ratio equal to the desired technological ratio of capital to, that's right, output. Then we can solve for this G star, and here's what it works out to be. If you're familiar with the Harrod article, this will look familiar to you. Actually, if you're familiar with the Harrod article, you might not recognize this delta. Harrod assumed depreciation was 0. So he just had the growth rate as being the marginal propensity to save divided by the capital output ratio. His notation was a bit different, but this is what he got. If you would generalize this for depreciation, then you subtract off the depreciation rate. Now, this is a warranted rate of growth. It satisfies this equation. So in a sense, if you expect the warranted rate of growth, you will in fact get it. You know, if you expect the steady state, you get it. So it's steady state in that sense. My first published paper, this is a nostalgia trip for me, 1984 Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, was about this issue. This is actually a rational expectations equilibrium, right? This is rational expectations is often broadly used in the new classical context, but it can apply here too. We have an expectations model that it is the case that this model has a rational expectations equilibrium, and it would be this warranted growth path where the growth rate is always equal to this G star. Now, here's the bigger issue though, that the warranted rate is sometimes used as a prediction for long-run growth. We say, well, okay, this is kind of standard economic analysis. We solve for the steady state and we say, okay, therefore, this is the economy's long-run rate of growth. And a variety of things are going to come up. And one thing you'll notice is it's completely anti-Keynesian if you look at it that way, right? Because this says higher S, higher growth rate. People save more, then that's going to lead to a higher growth rate. It actually says basically similar conundrum with the V. A higher V star would normally be thought of as more investment, as you need more investment to generate a particular level of growth. So it raises demand, but it actually lowers the steady state growth rate. So the warranted rate of growth looks like a very un-Keynesian kind of result. If anything, it's more like a solo growth model. Now, of course, the solo growth model, the rate of saving does not affect the long-run steady state of rate of growth, which is the rate of technological progress only, but it does affect the short-run rate. So this does look more like a traditional neoclassical growth model if you thought of it as actually having empirical content, as you thought of it as an actual center of attraction, this attractive path for the economy. But it's not. It's analytical, but not empirical content. So it's interesting as a benchmark to think of this steady state. Why? Because it's unstable. Because the economy does not converge to this level. This is it's kind of interesting analytically, but it does not, I would not never say it's a prediction because if you're off of it, you're not going to go towards it. It's helpful to analyze the model. So it's not a path of attraction for the economy. That's important to keep in mind. So let's look at that issue and think about the instability. The paper goes into this a little bit more detail. Let me just give you some intuition about how instability works here. If you are in the neighborhood of the warranted path and there's some kind of deviation, a shock, say, in the expected growth rate away from the warranted G star, it's going to be that expectation is going to be magnified by the dynamics. So let's look at this a little bit. This little simple analytical calculation is helpful. Again, it's straightforward to do this. I'm not going through all the algebraic steps. So if you look at the derivative of the actual growth rate with respect to the expected growth rate, it comes out this way. So it's this would be the one that would come out. And this is in the I thought I changed this. I'm still not 100% sure I've got the right slides. I think I've got the right slides. Anyway, this in fact should be what I intended to have here was expected growth instead of the G star. But we're going to evaluate it. We're going to evaluate the derivative in the neighborhood of the path. So where expected growth shows up here on the right-hand side. In fact, let me just show that to you. It's straightforward. Here it is. So if you were to take the derivative of this with respect to expectations, you see you're going to get a 2 V star times 1 plus EG here, and you'll get a 1 minus S there. That's all I did. Nothing to it. And so then in this case, if I had put EG on that spot, then you'd see this derivative. But I want to evaluate this So it could be any place, right? I mean, depending on what EG is. The derivative could be big, it could be small. But in the neighborhood of the warranted path, I would replace the EG, the actual expected growth, by the warranted growth rate. So that's where I'm evaluating the derivative. And so here's kind of the interesting thing. If you look at this, kind of look at this equation and just hold this G star term constant. It would be better if it were EG here. And it would say, okay, well, I can see this. So let me try to give you a little more intuition for this. If this derivative is, 1 is an important number. So you're talking about a shock to expectations. Any kind of sense, obvious Keynesian model, if people expect more demand growth, there's going to be more demand. There's going to be some reinforcement. The question is this: if I expect 1% more, what do I actually get? Do I get 1% more? Do I get 0.5% more? Or do I get 1.5% more? Is the derivative greater than, less than, or equal to 1? If the derivative is less than 1, you say, well, I expected an extra 1% of growth, I got 0.5%. Now, okay, so I'm going to lower my expectations, and it's going to be stable. You're going to converge. If the derivative is greater than 1, you say, I expected to get 1% more, but I actually got 1.5% more. It's going to pull me away and be explosive. So this derivative is crucial to understanding whether the model's stable or not. Now, if you just looked at this first equation, especially if you've replaced G star with EG, you'd say, well, it kind of depends. It could be bigger, it could be smaller. The expectation could be anything. But once you say, let's evaluate it at the warranted path. Well, the warranted path, we know what this is. It's this. And so this substitution is there. And look what happens. So you'd say, well, suppose, and I thought this way, suppose I want to make the model stable. I should be, what would make a Keynesian model stable? A smaller marginal propensity to consume, a bigger marginal propensity to save. If people save a bigger share of their income, then when the economy, when there's a shock, well, it doesn't, the model, there's not as big of a multiplier. Things are going to be more stable. And that looks to be more or less true here, right? This derivative will be smaller, the larger is little s. And similar kind of story for V star. But it works the opposite way when you plug it in the G star here. They cancel out. That you now work this way through and say, I can't make this derivative bigger than smaller than 1 by changing s, because I get s working in two different ways. Here, a higher s makes the derivative smaller, but here, a higher s makes the derivative bigger. And in fact, when you work through the algebra, this effect dominates that effect. So you see, I get a 2s from there, and I get a minus s from here, so I got a 1 plus s at the end. So that as long as s is greater than 0, I'm not going to be able to ever push this derivative below 1. So you see that the final term is 1 there plus 2 positive things, s and this investment term, and it's going to be bigger than 1. It's generic. You want a question? Yeah. Sorry about the bias here. I could kind of stand over here because of my computer. I haven't forgotten you. I know you're over here.
I suppose my question just comes down to what if s is negative? In other words, what if people have a propensity to borrow?
Haven't thought about that one. So s is negative. Interestingly, if the warranted growth rate is negative, then I have to think about it. So in other words, remember so the economy, the steady state path itself is a contraction path. Has to be, even if delta is equal to 0, because it's s over v minus delta. So I think my sense is, and this is just a kind of a quick intuitive response, not a formal response, is that's going to resolve what seems to be the conundrum, which is that it seems like, well, maybe I could stabilize things with a negative s, but I'm actually stabilizing in the wrong direction. I'm stabilizing a contracting path. So.
Isn't that what has happened in the years running up to 2008? I mean, people were spending to consume, and that led to the...
I agree. I have recently written an empirically oriented paper that has a marginal propensity to, or that finds the average propensity to consume greater than 1 for the U.S. economy. Interestingly, especially for the bottom 95% of the U.S. economy, the income distribution. So yes, I think that's an interesting question, and it's probably I should work at that. That's beyond the capability of this model to kind of handle right at this point, but it's an interesting question. Okay, so what I want to say here is somewhat subject to this criticism, but I think it'll carry through. Because I mean, this could be really interesting, kind of empirically, and what this implies as we have a kind of explosive borrowing. But I'm pretty sure that what I'm saying here is going to carry through even to a negative S, which is the instability is going to be highly generic. That is, you know, you can think about changing parameter values, but you just can't get rid of it. This is a very robust, simple but very robust mathematical conclusion. Of course, I'll get everybody who's mathematically oriented in the audience now thinking about this. How can I get this? Please do think about that, and let me know. Send me email. I've been thinking about it for 3 or 4 years, and ultimately, at least in this term, I think it's hard to overturn this basic, unstable result. So instability here being highly generic, which of course is this view that this may be a kind of fundamental characteristic of a demand-driven economy. Okay, let me now turn to expectations. So in a way, this is kind of a one-period result. It says if there's a shock to expectations, then that shock will be magnified. What then happens through time, it depends on how those expectations evolve. So what we get from the instability result is point 1 here, that if the expected growth rate is below the warranted rate, then the actual rate is below the expected rate. And let me just run that again. So the fact that a negative shock to expected growth causes actual growth to fall, nobody's surprised. But it's bigger than that, see? It says that the actual growth rate will be below the expected growth rate. So again, suppose the warranted rate is 3%, people expect 2%, you're going to get 1.5 or 1.8 or 1 or 0.9, something below what you actually expect. This is, this is the instability result. You're not going to get 2.5. You're not going to get, well, warranted rate is 3, I expect 2, I get 2.5 or 2.2, I can kind of close the difference. It's not going to happen. This is the generic instability result. The next restriction is a behavioral restriction. So this is kind of number 1 is the structure of the model. Number 2 is an additional assumption. And it is this, which is that if the expected growth rate, the actual growth rate is below what you expected, you will revise your expectations downward. By the way, these inequalities can all be reversed. So here the story is, I will adjust my expectations in the direction of the most recent error. Now notice it doesn't say how much I adjust them. It just says I adjust them. So again, use my example. So warranted rate is 3%, you expect 2%, you get 1.5%. All I'm saying is your next expected growth rate will be below 2%. How much below 2%? Whatever. Epsilon below 2%. It could be small, and that's going to be sufficient for instability, that you move in that direction. So the idea here is a sense of learning, that the expectation rule will move the expectation in the most recent error, in the direction of the most recent error. What my 1984 paper actually talks about is this rational expectations equilibrium, but the idea that it's unstable. That is, any kind of learning process is not going to let you converge to it. That we have a rational expectation equilibrium, but learning will not get you there. There's a pretty good-sized literature. I don't think it gets a lot of emphasis, and I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to it. More mainstream new classical literature on learning and whether it converges to rational expectations. There's kind of a mixed results there. But in this model, it's clearly not true. That kind of sensible learning, this type of behavioral restriction will lead to instability. And so my question here is, you can define so-called rational expectations, but are they even rational? It doesn't even make sense to think of them as rational in any sense if a learning process does not converge to that expectations consistent equilibrium. So what I just said there, I think, is a better label for so-called rational expectations. It's really an equilibrium concept. It's a concept of expectations, of the actual results of the model being consistent with what people expected over time, which may or may not be true. I mean, that's an equilibrium concept. We might converge there, we might not. And so as I point out here, conditions 1 and 2 are sufficient for instability of G star of the warranted path. So here's you can see those okay on the slides. Here's some pictures that show you that I can either do algebra or write simple MATLAB code, and they actually agree with each other. So I just wrote this up in MATLAB, and you'll see I'll do some simulations in a minute. They're more interesting. These aren't very interesting, but here's here's a a simple model that is for 5 periods on the warranted path. So the green is the warranted steady state path, and I get a negative shock, and the actual path goes to 0. What do you know? The algebra must be right. Okay, so this is Herod, right? I mean, now what have I shown you so far is a exposition of Herod with maybe a few more modern twists and turns, thinking a little bit about expectations, rational expectations, equilibrium, these kinds of things, but nothing really fundamentally, in my view, more than what you would have read in Herod 1939, so many, many, many years ago, 70 plus. Fine, but not terribly profound. Okay, let's push ahead here a little bit. First off, I want to consider, remember, just to review, now the motivation will be a little more clear, that the idea is broadly to exploit this Herodian instability to generate a model which can kind of broadly at least generate demand growth, persistent demand growth over time. So it requires, a couple of things. It kind of requires containing this extreme instability both on the upside and the downside. So let's talk about the downside. And I won't go through the various thought processes that went here, but in some respects it's remarkably simple from my point of view, and so simple that I could hardly believe that it hadn't been done before. I kind of wish Peter Scott, who's giving the inequality lecture, I wish he were here. Peter is a great expert, much more so than I, in kind of demand-driven growth models, especially of the Herod variety, and I should talk to him about this directly. I've sent him this paper, and he's comments driven by actual income and expected income. They're both being driven by the economy. So as the economy is contracting, you get a negative demand shock, consumption falls, investment falls, and you get this cumulative instability. Well, what if there's some anchor in that process? What if there's some part of demand that is not driven by the actual results of the economy? So I've got a simple one here. Actually, this is more than necessary, as you'll see in a minute. In the simulation models that I'll show you, this is the version we use, which is at least an F component. So F is for fixed or autonomous. That it just grows at, in this case, and I'll generalize this later, but it grows at the warranted rate. It doesn't have to grow at the warranted rate, and I'll talk more about that before. But there's just some kind of part of demand that's just moving along on its own, kind of on its own logic. Let me suggest here, if you want to give this a more economic interpretation, think about government spending in this context. Some kind of fiscal policy. I don't know if F, when we first put that notation, if we were thinking fiscal or not, but to think about it as some part of demand that's not kind of cyclical, that does not move with the business cycle. So this stabilizes demand on the downside. And here's the relevant law of motion in this context. You saw this before. All it does is add this one term. I mean, it's straightforward. We just, you just have an ft, and when you divide through by yt minus 1, you get this ratio. So when you look at this, you can see what's going to go on, though. That think about the economy on this, on this path. Oops, on this path, this downward explosive path that we had before. Now, but that's with f equal to 0. Now make f positive, and that's all you need here. Actually, I've got an ft, but it could just be a constant, a small positive constant. As long as this numerator stays where it is, then as output contracts to 0, eventually this term is going to run away with the dynamics. That's obvious with these other terms because they're just basically given. I mean, well, the expectations and are moving down there, but expected growth is actually bounded by -1. The lowest growth expectation you can have is that the world disappears tomorrow. That's what expectation G equals -1 means, and so these terms are going to disappear as expectations go downward. This one's maybe a little bit less obvious, but what's happening here is capital and output are moving down together. So as the economy contracts, business firms don't need as much capital. They lower their investment, and capital eventually depreciates. So this kind of ratio is bounded and stays basically stays more or less constant around that V star level, and then but this that's constant, or I mean I've got it growing here, but it could be a constant, and then yt minus 1 is falling. So all you really need for f, in fact, a constant will do. I think all you really need is that as y goes to 0, that f doesn't, so that this ratio goes to infinity as y. So whatever y is doing, f's got to do it more slowly. But again, think of it as autonomous demand. Think of it as just a constant. And this will dominate the dynamics and eventually have to turn growth positive. All the rest of these terms are going, this one's going to zero, this one's going to zero. And so eventually this is gonna be the dominant, and we'll have to flip it around. So that's the mathematics, which I'm not doing all the justice to. I wonder if I should just jump to this picture. So there we go. Once again, I can do a little bit of math, and I can do some simple MATLAB code. So this is a kind of wild picture on purpose, because I made this very, very small. This F star, so let me just say, this particular specification of F has this floor growing at the G star over time, but this is, I've calibrated this and calibrated it to be 1% of total demand. So just a tiny fraction of the total demand, but it's enough. And so we get a negative shock. It looks like we're headed down to zero, but well, when you get way, way down there, eventually it turns around and goes exploding out the top end. And so it will do it. I mean, any positive value of F is gonna turn things around. So let's interpret this a little bit more. So here's a kind of an interesting calculation. So this is basically the same equation you've seen before, but what I'm doing here is trying to find the level of output at the minimum of the cycle. So I'm trying to find, in a sense, the floor. It's not strictly speaking in this model the floor, but it's close to that. So it's this output level before the growth rate turns up. The discrete time aspect of it makes it not strictly speaking negative. You kind of overshoot this a little bit, but it gets that. I think in continuous time it literally would be a floor. So to solve this equation for this minimum at this minimum point, and when actual growth is equal to 0, so that's why the 1 plus g has just become a 1. Work this all out and I get this expression, which looks kind of complicated. But if you stare at that for a few minutes, you realize it's actually a very familiar expression. This is a simple static Keynesian multiplier. This is F, the autonomous expenditure, divided by, roughly speaking, a marginal propensity to save and a marginal propensity to invest. To make that clearer, you can do some special cases. Suppose not only is actual growth equal to 0, which is by definition where the economy is at this minimum at the floor, but expected growth is equal to 0 too. They're kind of following each other, and set the capital output ratio equal to the V star, and you get this much simpler version. It's F over S, you see it there, and delta V star would be the marginal propensity to invest with expected growth of 0. In other words, you would just invest enough to replace depreciation. And so this is a typical, marginal propensity to save minus a marginal propensity to invest. So that the minimum here is the simple textbook Keynesian multiplier. Well, maybe that's a little bit of an understatement, because the real thing is this way, and it's kind of complicated looking, but it can be interpreted with the logic of the simple Keynesian. And it makes sense when you think about it. There's some, so what's the minimum? And the minimum is not just F, but it's the demand induced by F. So that once F's not going to fall below any level, but given F, that's going to generate some income, and some income is going to generate some consumption and some investment, and so that becomes the bottom of the economy. So here we go. So now we're kind of adding some nuance to the basic heritage story in terms of interpreting what things are going on here. So, I said, what is F? Well, strictly speaking, it's any component of demand that does not vary with the state of the economy. Government spending is an obvious factor. In fact, we're hoping to do a generalization of this model to fiscal policy, and we're going to look at this specifically in terms of government spending. You might think about counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That is, you might even have F rising faster in a recession and falling more slowly, or rising more slowly in a boom. To kind of stabilize things, but that's an obvious interpretation. But it doesn't have to be just government spending. You could think about consumption and investment spending that does not depend on the state of the economy. I even think this is an extension. I might, towards the end of the paper, I'll mention it now, that income distribution may have something to do with this, in the sense that if you have, say, relatively high income consumers, their consumption may not fall as dramatically when income falls. They may maintain their consumption, do some kind of consumption smoothing over time. There could be a a variety of ways to go beyond just the more obvious fiscal policy interpretation. On the investment side, one of the things I think about is something like R&D innovation, where you might have some level of investment that's not driven by today's economic state, but by the movement of knowledge per se. I would still think that would be somewhat pro-cyclical, but there may be a component of it that actually is, people are always trying to find something new, so there might be some part of investment that stays there. Another factor could be just, basic replacement investment. Although if the economy is absolutely collapsing to zero, you'd want to, you probably want to let your capital depreciate. So that one's not so obvious. But there could be more subtle discussions than just government spending for F. That's the point here. The bigger F is, the kind of higher the floor, and the less, the less the economy can fall away. This example here was, kind of purposely extreme, just to show that even a tiny bit of F would be enough to turn the economy around, although it's not too encouraging that you start at 1,000 and you turn around, it looks like, at about 40. That's a rather nasty decline, a 96% decline in output before it turns around. So the simple story would be, let's hope F is bigger than 1%. And in practice, it probably is if this model has empirical relevance. Okay, so this is the downside. The upside is, in many respects, less significant and probably much more like just what Hicks and others have done, which is, how do we model the ceiling? Well, the idea here is it's supply. That ultimately, the ceiling, the upside instability is contained by the amount that the economy is capable of producing. I mean, with just the floor, isn't this where I did it before? Nope, I went the wrong direction. Sorry. With just the floor, you just explode past this. Here's the, warranted path. You're just going to go off to infinity. Well, you can't produce what you can't produce. And ultimately, if demand keeps rising, it's eventually going to run into capacity constraints. And so the idea here is that if demand starts to be greater than Y star, which is this potential supply-determined output, then output will actually be constrained by capacity. This next point is a little bit of a technical point, which is if expectations exceed that we're just kind of saying that firms recognize that, and they'll adjust their expectations to be consistent with Y star. So if there's a question here, we'll pass the microphone over.
Just a quick question. Sorry. What ensures that the warranted growth rate is the same than the growth rate of the labor force?
Nothing.
Because
it is so far in the simulations I've shown you, but we'll talk. But go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe go ahead.
No, that was the only question.
Yeah. All right. So that there's nothing here so far except arbitrary assumptions. So to kind of show nice simulations, I've done this, and so I guess you're right. I didn't actually say it, but it's on the slide. Effective labor supply growth exogenous rate G star, and I say this is the simplest case. So, in other words, there's a kind of consistency. Maybe I'll just go a little bit further, and then I'll talk about reconciling these. By the way, though, this is an important problem in the Herod literature. So the old Herod literature, there was kind of two problems. One was the instability knife edge, which I've emphasized a lot. The other one was that there's nothing in the model that says that the warranted rate of growth should be equal to the actual rate of growth of the labor force or productivity adjusted rate of growth of labor force, which is certainly true. In some ways, that second problem doesn't, I always thought, or I don't know if I always thought this, but I now think of this as it's kind of irrelevant. If the steady state isn't a point of attraction for the economy, who cares what it is, whether it's equal to the growth of the actual or not? It's just an analytical result. I think part of the reason that second problem, the difference between the warranted path and the what Herod called the natural path, the rate of growth of the labor force adjusted for productivity, why that's become kind of an issue in this literature is in part because people think, well, the economy should converge to the steady state path, and if it's not growing at the same rate as the labor force, then we could have either, like unemployment going to zero and all sorts of excess demand for labor, or maybe more of a concern, persistently rising unemployment, which has been a reason why people have somewhat rejected the Herod model, because they say, well, that doesn't happen. Unemployment can get really bad, but it doesn't grow without bound. So this model doesn't seem to be right. But once you kind of recognize that the warranted path is unstable, that becomes less of an issue. But I'll address this more substantively with our model in a minute. So the issue here is that we're going to impose this resource constraint on the top. So here's what happens, again, in this very special case where we just happen to assume that the warranted rate equals the growth rate of the labor force equals the steady state of the demand process. And so here's a single shock. Again, you get the drop. Once again, I'm imposing the very small f here. But instead of busting through the path, it just, by assumption, really, there's nothing more to it than this. It just is constrained along the long-term path. Now, here's a more realistic application. So up till now, I'm just kind of putting the model through its paces. Now let me try to make it more realistic. So first off, I'm not going to claim this is in any sense empirical. I'm just trying to calibrate something to give me a roughly interesting dynamic path. So let's set this autonomous demand share not to 1%, but to 35%. The capital output ratio of 1 is a little low for the U.S., but is in the range of reasonable. And then I'm going to give the economy a random uncorrelated shock with a standard deviation of 0.5%. The steady state growth rate is calibrated to 3%. And then you get my favorite picture in the paper, which is this one. So here's the economy, the kind of full employment path, and the actual path is bouncing below it. And and always coming back to, well, what's happening here is that when you get a negative shock, and there's some small negative shocks, there's some bigger negative shocks that you're seeing more, there's positive shocks that don't go anywhere because you're constrained by full employment. But what's broadly happening is the negative shocks do generate a movement away from the warranted path, but they get picked up by the floor and you get positive instability. And positive instability keeps pushing until you get either another negative shock, or if the shocks are positive and the dynamics continue, it pushes you back up to full employment. But it always pulls you back, it pulls you back, it pulls you back. So you get this somewhat more realistic perspective on ultimately the supply side path pulling you forward. So let me talk a little bit about what's going on in this context. So first off, to kind of tie together the first part of our discussion with this more specific research paper, there's no price adjustment mechanism to close this demand gap. I also mentioned monetary policy. I don't think I talked about that in the first part again, but in the more modern new Keynesian models, monetary policy is the kind of alternative to wage and price adjustment to bring you back to full employment. I have my issues with that, but let me put that aside for the moment. So, this is a kind of endogenous, not policy-driven result. I mean, you could argue that maybe F itself is policy-driven. That would be a fair point. But the convergence to full employment here is being generated by the inherent dynamics of the model. But it's a very different world than the neoclassical synthesis world or things like that, the mainstream textbook world. The demand growth here is the result of really two features. One is positive instability that drives demand upward when you're moving in that direction, plus the floor to contain autonomous demand. There's nothing in the textbooks about those factors at all. Apparently I can't spell here. I'm not wearing my glasses. It looks like like 3 C's in a row. That's supposed to be an O. So it's occasionally touch supply constrained path. But the Y star path is typically unstable. So the picture is a little bit misleading. The picture suggests you spend kind of a long time sometimes along the full employment path. I think it's the nature of these shocks and the way I've set that up. But the theoretical model itself would say once you get to the full employment path, there's no reason to think you're going to stay there. And that you will typically bounce off of it endogenously. Don't have a negative shock necessarily, but you'll actually bounce off of it and head back down again. What will happen is that the economy is going to be fluctuating in a corridor. The corridor is going to be determined by, on the top, full employment, on the bottom, this floor process, this kind of Keynesian multiplier of autonomous demand, and it's bouncing around in there. And that's what's going on. The other factor here is that demand is the proximate constraint on the economy most of the time. So here the idea is that it's not like we're converging to some stable full employment path. That is, sometimes we're constrained because of this instability by the upsides of resource constraints, but most of the time the economy is constrained by demand. Most of the time demand is driving the economy. So it's the proximate constraint, and I'll put except in these unusual occasional points where it happens to bounce off off the top path. Now, so again, the focus here, what this does is say, well, we got to look at it as a demand generating process. You know, I mean, this is a very simple-minded model with linear investment and things along those lines. It doesn't have finance, it doesn't have household behavior, negative savings rates, you know, all sorts of things that I think are fundamentally important to understand the actual evolution of the modern macroeconomy. But it kind of, you know, where I'm hoping is not that it's empirically realistic as such, but it's setting the stage. It says, well, it's that demand process we have to look at to see what's happening. A couple of more results that help get into some of these issues about different things. So here's something that, well, I should have known. It's really not so hard to recognize, but I kind of missed. I thought of in putting initially in the initial analysis of the paper, I missed this, that when you put in the F, and I thought of that as kind of intuitively as this is containing the downside instability for reasons I said before, but you know, it might actually contain the upside instability too. That is, it is a bit of an anchor, right? It's holding the demand process out. So if you think about a positively explosive Herod process, consumption's rising, investment's rising, output's rising, encouraging more consumption, more investment, and you get this cumulative explosion on these things. Well, and there's good old F sitting there doing its F thing, whatever that is, constant or growing at some, you know, exogenous rate, and it's going to eventually kind of potentially pull it back down. Now here it's not guaranteed. On the downside it's guaranteed. It has to happen. A non-zero F, it will make the economy bounce off zero. Maybe it gets close to zero, but it bounces off zero. Top side, it depends on the, you know, it now becomes complicated dynamic math, which I have not done. I've only explored this with simulations, but sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you just explode even with an F, but sometimes not. Here's the effect of a large F. I believe this is from the paper. I think what we did, it was like 35% in the other case. This one is now 50%. And look what's happening. It's keeping, it never gets there, right? F grabs the demand before you get to the full employment path. So this now becomes a possibility. That is that, you know, so here, I don't want to necessarily consider this a policy trade-off because I don't think it quite fits that characterization at this point, but it's kind of like that in some respects. You'd say, well, is a big F good or is it bad? Well, it kind of depends. On the downside, a higher F will push that floor up. It'll help. It'll prevent downside instability. But on the upside, it may prevent the economy from ever reaching the full employment path, and that you see that here. And so that these peaks of these cycles start to deviate away from the full employment path because of large F. I'm thinking, let's see, maybe this is the right place to bring up the idea. Well, what if F is not growing at the warranted rate, or okay, let's do that. If F is not growing at the warranted rate, it really doesn't make any difference. In some broad sense, well, maybe I shouldn't quite say that. It kind of depends on whether you get this state or the other one, but broadly speaking, the economy is going to bounce between a floor and full employment. If you're going to get to full employment, if F does not keep you away from the full employment path, then what's really driving the economy is the ceiling that's resource constrained and the floor that's driven by autonomous demand and the other parameters. And the steady state is what it is. It could be above it, it could be below it, it really doesn't matter. So that's really not so much of an issue. It kind of sidesteps that whole kind of debate in the Herod, in the literature related to Herod. The bigger problem, and I think, now that I think about it, this simulation probably has that characteristic. So not only does this keep the economy away from full employment, but I think I've got F growing more slowly than potential output. And what that's going to do, and again, there's two broad kinds of qualitative results you can get. In one case, so think about it this way, you've got potential output growing at 3% and F growing at 2%. So you've got, you know, this corridor is expanding over time. The floor is not growing fast enough. So one possibility is the economy just keeps bouncing between bigger, and the cycles would explode over time. They just get bigger and bigger and bigger. You bounce between the floor, but you have enough upward instability to driving you up against the ceiling. The other is this one, which is that eventually you pull away, that the F turns over not only the bottom of the cycle, but the top of the cycle. The growth path is entirely demand determined, and there's no convergence to the full employment. So it gets to be more complicated, and in a way you could say, well, all right, so this suggests, in a sense, demand growth is not guaranteed. What I guess I can say, I think I can say this analytically from the paper results, is that if F is growing, demand growth is guaranteed. If F were flat, if F is constant, that's not true. Although you could get long-term demand growth if there's enough upward instability that it keeps driving you up against full employment as long as technology is expanding. Question back here. Send the microphone back. Everybody says they can speak loud enough, but sorry?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to preface this, but I'm not a MA student in economics, but if we make the I think at least partially realistic assumption that F growth is somewhere close to G growth, would a testable implication of what you're theorizing be that economies that have a much larger autonomous component, so in the real world probably a larger government, not that they would grow faster or not necessarily even slower, but their business cycles would be much more compressed?
Yes,
actually be able to test that?
Yes, and well, I mean, could we test it? In principle, yes. Okay, so good. So there's an empirical implication, which is the bigger the share of autonomous demand, in some sense, the smaller the corridor of fluctuation. So yes, we could test that. I mean, in principle, we could. The trouble here is identifying autonomous demand. Maybe we could identify government, so that might be a source of this, and that might be an interesting. Not to say that large government economies grow faster, but they are more stable. So that's something that one could look at. My rough sense is that's probably true. I know, at least historically for the U.S., one simple stylized fact is that in the post-World War II era, when the U.S. economy, the U.S. government was much larger for two reasons. One, because of the big increase in defense in the post-World War II era compared to the pre-world, so bigger government for that reason, and also the New Deal reforms and other aspects that drove towards bigger government. That there was a big increase in stability. So that's kind of interesting. Whether this holds in other countries, I wouldn't know off the top of my head. The other factor, though, that's interesting about your comment is that, and I think it was Peter Scott in particular who gave me this comment, and I haven't done anything about it yet, is that it suggests a kind of need for not only possibly large government, or at least large autonomous demand, but that it has to grow, I mean, at the right level. So if we've got productivity growing, we've got labor force expanding, there's some kind of, in Harrod's terms, natural rate of growth out there, and we can't, we don't want this, right? We don't want this falling away over time. And even if it does occasionally bounce up there, we'll just raise the volatility, and in this case, you might never even get there. So is there this question, is it endogenous or not? I think this was Peter Scott's question. Is there some kind of endogenous process that would say, well, the government's going to grow at the rate of productivity? It doesn't seem immediately obvious to me, but you could think of this as actually kind of a policy implication, that the idea is you cannot actually generate long-run growth without at least some component of autonomous demand being pulled along. And since, I mentioned, well, maybe there's consumption and investment that could belong in here, but that's going to be up to people's decisions whether that's going to grow or not. And so it could suggest that the idea of somehow, I don't know, so forgive the American bias here, but there's this a guy, Grover Norquist, who has suggested that what we want to do with government is, what's the story? Shrink it down large enough, in that we drown it in the bathtub, make it so small that we can put it down the drain. Something like that. That, in other words, let's get rid of the government is the basic implication there. We want small government. So in the instability point, I think, would come there. But even if it's small government, it better grow. It better kind of move along with the economy. It's not crazy at some level. I mean, the idea that would be that as the economy grows, as its potential grows, that there would be need for these additional, say, government services that would come from that. But you know, this is not a public finance argument. This is a macroeconomic argument, you know, for that perspective. Another question here?
To pick up again on that propensity to borrow, which, as I understood it, would be stabilizing, or it would not reach full, the economy wouldn't reach full potential, because you wouldn't get the instability on the upside. So I wanted to go back to something you said right at the beginning about wage-driven 1960s growth compared to consumption and driven sort of post 1974, whenever. So my concern is if you go back to that earlier period, which is there is a propensity to save, you do reach full potential output, but with debt-driven consumption, you don't.
Okay, so again, it's pushing me a little bit beyond where I'm comfortable going analytically, because I hadn't really thought about this negative saving rate idea in the context of this model. That said, I'm pretty confident of the following statement, which is, again, you have to be a little careful about this warranted path stuff, and that, because that's the context in which this came up. Well, what if S is negative? And well, it was with instability. It's pretty clear to me that if you have, because the model is basically Keynesian. If you have people borrowing like crazy in one of these upswings, it's just going to make it go faster up. In other words, it's not going to stabilize. I know that was kind of the intuition looking at that derivative, but you know, the simple law of motion says the more consumption you're getting at the margin, so a given change in expected growth generates more and more consumption over time, it's going to keep driving the growth rate higher and higher. So in that respect, I think that you're going to get, you know, it's going to magnify the upward instability, but only as long as it continues. You know, so we're just about out of time, and I'm kind of to the last few slides anyway. And one of the extensions, which is on the slide, but I'll mention it now, just straight up, is this idea. And so here, let me just kind of broaden the point, but I'm going to answer your respond to the comment. So, you know, like, is this model really, you know, right? In one sec, do we really believe it? It's one thing to sit here and, you know, write your models and do your equations and code your MATLAB and watch your fun simulations and say, look at this cool stuff that's happening. It's another thing to actually believe that what's happening is relevant for understanding the world in which we live. And I kind of care about that last issue. In fact, I should take out the stupid Americanism, kind of. I care about that issue. And it should be that the model is relevant to the world in which we live. You have to abstract. You're not going to get every detail of things right, but you want to kind of get the main point right. Well, so what's the main point here? The main point on the upside is that the economy is rising, 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 the upward instability goes, and if you do get to full employment, which we seem to do every once in a while, yeah, you know, you bang up against it and then you bounce off of it. And so what turns the business cycle at the top is resource constraints. And then, kind of coming to the point here as I understand it about consumer borrowing and what's actually happened historically in recent years, that's not, in my view, what turned the economy in 2008. You know, the Volvo shock from the earlier time. You know, you can make a plausible argument. Some people, I think, kind of conventional estimates in the US, it was at full employment. I didn't see it so much. I mean, the unemployment rate was relatively low in the middle to high fours right before the recession. But, you know, there was a lot of inflation. You didn't get the sense the economy was booming, that capacity constraints or labor constraints were being stretched, any of those things. I mean, what turned the economy around was rising financial fragility. You know, somebody was interested in the kind of Minsky process. Rising financial fragility eventually broke. And when we got the negative financial, when it broke, that then spilled over very quickly to demand in the US, primarily in residential construction, but also in standard consumption. Business investment followed later, and we got a very, very nasty recession. Now, the dynamics look kind of like the picture, but what's turning this around to the top is different. And so, I mean, this is broadly speaking my response to this kind of thing, that in a way this model isn't ready for that, right? We don't have that financial fragility here. This is, and it might be that what turns things around is really much more historically specific. I mean, this could be right, and it could happen in some circumstances, but I'm thinking that any particular cyclical process may not be from this point of view. So my hope is that the model is a useful framework. but that it needs to be generalized to bring in these kinds of factors. And it's a little bit speculative of me to suggest I know what's going to happen, because I certainly don't. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. I'm wondering if anybody cares about any of this. Policy implications I've talked a little bit about. So rather than, I don't know exactly what the plan is here. I don't think there's a big, tight time constraint, but I'd be happy. Are there other questions? Yeah, why don't we just have a discussion? I'll forget about the slides.
It's a bit follow-up on the two earlier questions.
Yeah.
On the definition of the F, I mean, it could be not only the government sector, but bringing in my point about the time lag before. For example, construction industry is based on investment decisions that are taken. You start to build a new shopping mall, and it takes, half a year to prepare and 1.5 years to build it. So there's a lag in, and if you have a lot of that, you have bigger F. And then when Lehman happens, you stop that, so you have a time lag on the other.
I think I've got the rough idea here. Pretty interesting and maybe rather involved extension of the model, which my brain is not capable of processing in real time. But a couple of responses. One is this has a lag in it. I mean, the lags are important in this model. Unlike the static model that I showed you in the first part, this everything's got lags. They're fixed. They're not changing. So that could be a bit, and they're the same. Actually, they're not the same. There's a 1-period lag for consumption and a 2-period lag for investment. And why? Because there's a 1-period lag for expectations, and then there's an additional period for investment, because once you have the expectation, you invest today for capital in the future. So broadly speaking, it's got that structure that you're talking about. And I wouldn't think of that so much as F. I mean, you could think about varying those things and changing these kinds of things, because the key here is that if you start to have a more complicated lag structure, you're adding, I mean, just from a kind of formalistic point of view, you're taking, the things actually are nonlinear. They're simple nonlinear equations, but they are nonlinear. You can't just use linear difference equation techniques, I think, to analyze this stuff. But it's once you add multiple lags, that could add different roots and make dynamics look more complicated. So but that's just a generic statement. I don't really know anything more beyond that. My sense is, though, as long as these things are kind of moving together, so even if they react with a lag, but the economy pulls this down or pulls this up and does that, that's not really F, But I think that's an open question. I mean, it's a good question. How do I know that? I don't know that. That is, could we put more complicated dynamic structure here and find that there is some other kind of mechanism that would stabilize this process? And I certainly can't, is it possible? So of course it's possible. So for people that are interested in, in the more technical side of dynamics, there are a lot of things, like limit cycles, for example, that could conceivably, happen in this context. I think it's probably right to say, well, it's a limit cycle or just a cycle. Heck, I'm not going to bother with it. I was going to say that last picture I showed might actually be a limit cycle, but I don't know that. Yeah.
Questions, please. The first one is, you said that you just assume that your growth rate, that the growth rate of the warranted growth path is the same as the growth rate of the labor force. And I wonder how critical this assumption is for the downturn. Because if we assume that the warranted growth path is below the resource growth path, so the resources grow faster than the warranted growth path, then you would, in the upswing, overshoot the warranted growth path, hit the resource constraint, and then would there be a downward movement again, because you're still above the warranted growth path where you have the upwards Herodian dynamics? So that's the first question. And the second one is on whether it is, or it's more like a comment. So I think that many Kaleckians or Keynesians would be critical calling this, or would they probably stress that actually in the long run, which you may define as the consistency between expectations and realizations, which is only true in your model on the warranted growth path. So assuming that this is the definition of the long run, then you don't have actually Keynesian features in the long run because your economy is supply determined in the long run on the warranted growth path and you have no paradox of thrift. There's no role for distribution. So I think that's why many
paradox of thrift is like my favorite concept of all time. Okay. In fact, I proposed to Enno Schroeder that I would talk about the paradox of thrift here. He said, no, you're not going to do that. Okay. He rejected it.
But I think
I'm exaggerating a little bit. But
I think that's why many Keynesians are critical of this Herodian type of models, because in the long run, what's counting is the Herodian or the warranted growth path, and you lose all the Keynesian features on that growth path. So,
okay,
what would be your response to that?
I'll tell you my response. It's very insightful two questions that are kind of broadly related. And so I might not get every nuance of that, but I think I've got the main point here. So first off, let's be clear, the warranted growth path has, I'm going to emphasize that the first few simulations I showed you just to show features of the model, the green line was the warranted growth path. But as the model gets more interesting and more nuanced, and you start to build the floor in and the ceiling, and you interpret these things, the warranted path drops away. That none of the paths that you see here are warranted paths. The warranted path is unstable. It may be sitting there, it may not be. The warranted path could even be above the potential output path in this model. I mean, again, my co-authors have bugged me about that. One of my co-authors has said, look, I'm not going to let you start not having the warranted path be kind of the same as the natural path because it'll be chaos. And it's actually not true. That really, the warranted path helps us understand really this one thing. It helps us understand instability. And so once you get the instability result, then the path is the path. And indeed, and so for example, on the paradox of thrift, I'll come back to the point about the long run in a second, but along the path, it clearly has a paradox of thrift. Look at the simple law of motion. It's a simple Keynesian model. I mean, it puts some T subscripts on, but otherwise it's entirely standard. When you reduce saving, when you increase saving, you're going to reduce output, and saving is going to be equal to investment period by period, and so the standard paradox of thrift results will hold at any point in time along this path. So it would be wrong for me to characterize this. Maybe I confused you a little bit to suggest that in some sense the warranted path kind of matters here for the actual path. The only sense in which the warranted path could kind of play a role is, let me go back here, is this picture, the effect of large F, this one. So I think it's probably correct to say that this is our stable cycles around the warranted path. That when in this case, where the ceiling doesn't bind, where everything is demand determined all the time, that here would be the warranted path. Now, but interestingly, I think that responds a bit to the comment, because in this particular case, the long run growth is entirely demand determined. It's not supply determined. And the necessary condition for this to happen, not sufficient but necessary, is that the warranted growth path be below, the growth rate be below the production path, because that's the only way they could deviate it. If the warranted path is higher and there are these stable fluctuations, eventually you're going to drive the peaks up against full employment. Now, let me just kind of reset here, because there was another aspect of your question I wanted to respond to. Yeah, this is very important. It's kind of in my final slides, but I'm not going to really go there because we're already over time. So, people should feel free to leave, and I won't be offended at all. I wouldn't have been offended if you left half an hour ago, but in particular, I won't be offended now. But I'm happy to stay around for a while and keep talking if people are interested. So, what are the long-run implications here? For these purposes, this picture, which actually is my favorite, is a little bit disconcerting. So I came into this as as kind of a true intrinsic fundamental radical Keynesian who wants to think of demand as being important in the long run, as has been kind of the broad program of Koleskian growth models. And then you look at this thing and you say, well, is it really? Is it not? So here's the way I would think of it. And again, in this context, I think the picture is a little bit misleading. I would think of the supply side in this context. So now when we actually do bump up against the ceiling, so F is not large enough to hold the economy away from the ceiling, that I think of the supply side as an upper envelope for the growth path. That is, there's this supply-driven growth path that's out there, and demand is usually below it, but every once in a while it touches it. Now, if that's the case, then over long sweeps of time, between those kind of peak points, the growth rates between those peak points are going to be driven by supply. Again, this picture isn't the best for this purpose, but you know, I say, well, demand is driving here and here and here, but between here and here, you know, that's supply-driven point. And you know, that's kind of bothered me a little bit, but I have to say, when I think about it, how else could it be? I mean, if you were to say that occasionally, maybe not very often, occasionally economies get to full employment. You know, I'll give you my own assessment of the U.S. economy. When was it in full employment? 1944, 1968, probably close to it in 1999. Between those points, you know, that's how much supply grew, because we're that full employment. It's almost a bit of a tautology in that context. Now you might say, look, we don't ever get to full employment. That may be possible. It's even possible that this model generates that result, in which case, you know, things are different. So that becomes kind of an interesting, nuanced empirical question. There are these kind of different possibilities. And my last response along these lines is something that's quite traditional and certainly sensible in the heterodox growth literature, which is one of the assumptions here, which is, because it's not the main point of this paper, but another way to extend this paper is say, well, maybe, and in fact it seems entirely sensible to me, that the full employment path itself, the Y-star path itself, is affected by the demand side. In which case productivity growth, labor supply, other kinds of things could be driven here. So here's where, like the earlier comment about policy and corridors and this kind of, it all starts to tie together. So you have a bigger F and you contain instability, which might mean that your labor productivity grows faster, or you have more R&D, so your potential output grows faster, and now you've got potentially a very rich set of possibilities in there. So obviously I'm sensitive to this point, that in a way the initial objective, you could kind of see this coming from the end of the first part of the discussion, was demand is the lever, demand is what's going to be driving the economy, and to kind of come out and then give this model which says, well, it's kind of like the neoclassical synthesis, but with just a little bit different twist, is in some sense disappointing. But I think, you know, we should think hard about that and push forward. What really is it that generates you know, effects of demand growth over the longer horizon?
Already touched on this, but because a lot of us are PhD students, maybe looking for research ideas, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about what you see as the open questions, or if you're like, if post-Keynesian is as a research program, like where does it move, or how does it move forward from here?
Okay, it's a big question, a perfectly sensible question, kind of a different. I mean, in a sense, if we're talking about it in a very general sense, I feel like I was in a bit of a different position than here, and maybe I can't think I might be quite fast enough to respond to, you know, the 5 most interesting questions in heterodox Keynesian economics here. But I think I can do better, since my brain is kind of engaged in instability and growth at the moment, in terms of this model. And so what kinds of suggestions, but not necessarily using this model for it. So would I be, you know, wonderfully flattered and just happy as anything if one of you sent me a paper a few years ago, I liked your talk and I worked on this and here's the model and I've generalized in this way, yeah, that'd be terrific. But I'm not necessarily suggesting that in some respects, but I think there are some issues here that come up. One of them is the one that we talked about just a few minutes ago with respect to integrating a more substantive financial process into this kind of a model. So in a way I feel, I mean, I've mentioned the term Minsky a number of times, but haven't said it much. It's unusual for me to speak for 3+ hours and not talk substantively about Minsky, who was my colleague at Washington University, and I've co-authored a paper with him, and it has a huge influence over my way of understanding the world. But the way that these particular things, you know, kind of played out, I didn't do much Minsky, but the, you know, I think financial instability is really pretty important, and so just to reset things a little bit, go back to the final picture, the demand-driven picture from my 4-quadrant diagram, saying demand is what moves things around. The question then becomes, which was the motivation for the second part, what are the dynamics of demand? You know, I gave this from a more developed Herod approach, or Herod developments beyond that, but Minsky has also a theory of demand growth, demand dynamics that are moving through time. And I think kind of melding broadly this approach into that is okay. Now there's been a fair amount of this has been done. There are formal Minsky models around, a lot of them. I've written some of them. Even the ones I've written, and I like my own research, but even the ones I've written, I'm not so crazy about. I don't think we've done such a good job of characterizing. And so here, let me say, I think this perspective, but this was before I had this paper on, in my head. If I were going to go after Minsky today, and I'm happy to have anybody pick up on this, from a more modeling approach, I'd want to kind of start like this because, to think about this more in the, how is it that, say, financial fragility could provide a ceiling on the economy? How is it that you have this process building up of more and more debt taken on, and then it breaks in some sense? What is the process that makes that break? What is the process that turns that around? I think just having a model that generates cycles, like I do it, write down a difference equation, and I take the characteristic roots, and they turn out to be complex, and say, look at that, I've got a cycle, is fine. I'm not good. Do it. I mean, do the analytics. But where does the cycle come from? What's the substantive process that turns the cycle around? One of the things I like about this approach is that's pretty clear. I mean, the ceiling, it's kind of obvious. I mean, it's blunt. It's very obvious. But the floor is a little more subtle in some respects. But the analytics come clear. There's no doubt about it. I don't have to tell you that the root is complex and that's just the way it is, and so it's a cycle. I can show you specifically what turns it around and talk about the characteristics at the bottom. So, I think on the finance and cycle, that's something I would like to see. I mean, something else we've talked about already would be this spillover between demand side and the supply side. So again, the broad vision, what I've tried to share with you today, is this notion of the autonomy of the demand side. That is, and this is really in some respects more driven as a response to the mainstream, where you've got the long run being entirely supply determined, and I want to say no, they're kind of working together. Over the long run, you have supply processes and you have demand processes. You got to have them both if you're going to have growth, but we've got to think substantively about the demand. But how can they interact? How do they interact over time? So this issue that we just talked about how, it could be that the path of demand could be effective for, how does it affect labor productivity? How does it affect labor supply? My co-author, maybe I'm giving away research topics. My co-author said, and I was initially skeptical, he said, let's have endogenous labor supply. Let's have labor supply respond to these kinds of things, and maybe we could, like get away from the hard constraint. And at first I think, oh, come on, why should I think labor supply responds to that? That's what the new classicals do all the time. But then he mentioned the phrase immigration, for example. Say, well, okay, that's maybe an interesting point. You have a booming economy, do you draw labor in? What are the implications of that? So, there's an example right there. I'm trying to think of other things that when I'm just, sitting down or like I wish I knew more about, but I don't, which would be kind of research questions. And I'm sure tonight I'll think about 8 of them, but I can't list any more off the top of my head right now. I should just pass the microphone one more down. Huh?
Clarify. Once you hit the green path, what drives it downwards?
Okay, so
Is it
typically,
the shock again to the expectations?
typically the green path is not literally the warranted path. So in some of these cases, it's probably true. In this case, the growth rate of the green path is the warranted path, but there's not, see, this is happening because of upward instability. Mm-hmm. So in particular, V doesn't equal V star along here. You may have a capital disequilibrium. I can't really, this has got continuous shock to that. As I actually get really close to it, I can see some of the wiggles close to the green path. So in a way, this kind of stochastic thing is not so good for looking at the analytical properties of the model per se. But I can tell you from doing simulations where I just let it run that typically the, when you hit the full employment, it's not, you bounce off of it. It's not, there's some, you're not in a, so what ends up happening is your growth kind of gets, ratcheted the other direction, and you head back downward. That's not the tightest answer. I'd like to actually look more at that. It's probably a worthwhile question. But broadly speaking, I can tell you from looking at thousands of simulations of this model that in general, you're not hitting, it's not like you come to this, converge back to the steady state and stay there in the absence of a shock.
Yeah, that was going to be.
Yeah.
So, like the initial fluctuation then starts with an initial shock. Or
Well, that's right. I mean, if I start the model just kind of by construction on the warranted path with nothing else happening, it will stay on the warranted path until the, if we're doing a simulation, until the error in the numerical, actual approximation that is deep down in the heart of the computer builds up. So if you've never done simulations before, let me warn you of this because it might drive you nuts, which is computers never compute everything exactly. They have a precision. And if you have an unstable model, which this is, eventually the errors of the way in which the computer approximates the actual number will get magnified. So if I set this at the warranted rate and let it run for 100,000 periods, it will eventually explode because the approximation error of the computation itself will actually get magnified. It's unstable. It's introducing a shock. That's kind of a flip answer to your question. But the point is that, as a practical matter, literally, if you had the exact calculation, if you're on the warranted path, you'd stay there. So you need something to get you going. Call it a shock or call it a structural change or anything. Anything would do it, right?
But then what is the difference of this in terms, this just then shifts the instability away from the real side supply shocks to real demand shocks, which makes the model in the spirit of Keynes. But still, if it is an independently, identically, normally distributed random variable, then it's gonna be an error term in your regression model, which means that that error term is the unexplained part. So basically, you don't explain the fluctuations. You leave it unexplained.
Well, I don't know. I think that's. I guess I would push back against that interpretation entirely, or somewhat. It's true that I put shocks in here to try to see what kind of see what happens, but I think my handlers are going to shut me up.
I like to do this, but there's a shuttle actually waiting for you
oh.
right now to take you
Oh.
back to your hotel if you need to go.
Oh, so I thought I could keep talking, but apparently I couldn't. I can keep talking, just nobody's here to listen. Yeah, I also have, because of my strange, I have a car I can take 2 people.